Hello and welcome to today's journey. Tonight, or perhaps during a quiet afternoon, we are not going to talk about dry numbers. We are not going to argue over sensational hypotheses. And we are not going to chase exaggerated cinematic images. Instead, we are going to walk slowly into a world that has vanished. A world where Earth was warmer, wetter, and wilder than any place you have ever known. A world before humans, before cities, before memory was written down. This is Earth in the Age of Dinosaurs. But don't think immediately of roaring monsters. Don't rush to imagine a chaotic park filled with violence. Let's begin with something simpler. Imagine that you are standing in the middle of a forest. There is no grass beneath your feet, only ferns stretching out like a green carpet. The air is heavy and humid, carrying the scent of tree resin and wet soil. Above you, conifers and cycads filter the sunlight into slow-moving patches of light and shadow. What do you hear? A constant hum of insects, the sound of water flowing somewhere in the distance, and deep beneath the ground, a low, slow vibration, like the breathing of the planet itself. You are standing on an Earth that is still learning how to become itself. In this video, we will explore together why Earth during the Age of Dinosaurs was able to sustain gigantic life forms, how forests, climate, and oceans were different from the world we know today, why massive herbivores did not merely live in their environment, but actively shaped it, how predators helped prevent ecosystems from collapsing, and how in the shadows of giant birds, small mammals and insects quietly shaped the future of life. This is not a story about the strongest. This is a story about balance. And if you are listening to this video before sleep, let the slow rhythm of the narration carry you along. And if you are fully awake, come with me beyond the limits of ordinary imagination. Now, let the Earth tell its own story. Close your eyes, relax your breathing, and let your mind drift very far away, far enough that in a very quiet moment you realize you are standing in the middle of a vast forest. There are no obvious signs that this world is different from the one you have known, only a vague but persistent sensation difficult to name, as if the space around you is wider than usual, deeper than usual, and quieter than every silence you have ever experienced in your life. The sky above you is not cut by any artificial straight lines. There are no rooftops, no power poles, no sharp edges familiar to the modern world. There is only a wide, high dome of space where sunlight does not fall directly downward, but is first filtered through layers of humid atmosphere, then broken apart again by thick canopies of trees, forming slow-moving patches of light and shadow on the ground, like the breathing of the planet itself. The air is heavy and moist, clinging gently yet persistently to your skin, carrying the scent of tree resin, of decomposing leaves, of wet soil that has just endured long periods of rain. Beneath your feet, there is no soft grass like that of modern plains, but a spread of ancient vegetation. Ferns grow densely in broad patches, their stems soft, yet resilient, crowding together as they reach upward toward the fragments of light that slip down from the forest canopy above. You stand still, not out of fear, but because it feels as though this world does not require you to move, as though it is already operating according to its own rhythm. So slow, it seems almost motionless, yet so powerful that nothing can resist it. And then you feel it. Not a clear vibration, not a jolt strong enough to throw you off balance, but something very deep, very indistinct, as if the ground beneath your feet is not entirely still, as if it is drifting slowly, almost imperceptibly. This is not the footfall of giant creatures that will appear later. This is not yet the Age of Dinosaurs. This is the Earth itself. Before endless jungles, before creatures as tall as buildings moved across the landscape, Before low calls echoed through valleys or hunts stretched on for hours, there was a deeper story unfolding, a story with no witnesses, no memory, no tragedy or heroes, only rock heat, pressure, and time. If you bend down and place your hand on the ground, you will not feel anything distinct because every movement taking place lies beyond the scale of biological life. But far beneath that solid crust, deep within the mantle of the planet, streams of molten material are moving slowly, viscous and dense, like an ocean that never sees the light. It is these flows, persistent and unceasing, that are stretching the surface of the earth, creating silent but continuous pressures, preparing for a transformation that will later determine where forests grow, where seas open, and how large life itself can become. There was a time, long before the moment you are standing here, before the very concept of continents carried the meaning it does today, when all the lands you know were joined together into a single mass. There was no Atlantic Ocean separating distant shores, no Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly across the map, no familiar coastlines etched into memory. North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and much of Asia all were merely different parts of the same continuous land, a single world, vast beyond easy comprehension. That world was called Pangaea. It was not a continent in the usual sense, but a supercontinent occupying nearly all of the planet's land surface. If you had lived in that time and stood deep within the interior of Pangaea, you could have walked for thousands of kilometers without ever seeing the sea, without hearing waves, without smelling salt in the wind. The interior would have been drier, the climate more extreme. Regions far from the coast were governed by sharp temperature contrasts, hot days, cold nights, and rain that rarely reached them. But that continuity, no matter how vast and seemingly stable, was never meant to last, because Earth was not made to stand still. Beneath the solid surface, you are standing on dozens, even hundreds of kilometers below, lies another world, hotter, slower, and constantly in motion. There, heat from the planet's interior causes material in the mantle to flow very slowly, like thick currents, without waves, without sound, yet carrying a force capable of reshaping the entire surface of the Earth. It was these silent movements that began to change Pangaea. Not with an explosion, not with a dramatic moment that every living thing could perceive, but with pressure. Pressure accumulating over millions of years, as tectonic plates below continued to shift, the crust above which seemed immovable began to stretch. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. The ground remained. Forests still grew. Rivers continued to flow. But deep within the crust grew thinner, weaker, like a thick fabric slowly pulled taut from many directions. It did not tear immediately. It endured. It stretched a little more, until in places under the greatest stress, the first fractures appeared. Not wide gaps, but lines of weakness zones where the ground could no longer hold its old shape. This was the beginning of rift valleys, long, narrow bands of land where the surface subsided as the crust was pulled apart from both sides. From above, they might have looked like ordinary valleys, elongated lowlands between plateaus. But geologically, they were open wounds on the body of the supercontinent. Along these fractures, magma from deep within the Earth began to rise, filling the newly formed spaces. As the magma cooled, it became layers of new basalt rock, marking each pulse of the planet's stretching. Each layer was a moment. Each moment lasted tens of thousands of years. And throughout all this time, life on the surface barely noticed anything unusual. A dinosaur walking across a forming rift valley would not know it was stepping along the boundary of a future ocean. A forest growing on cooling volcanic rock would not know that beneath its roots lay the seed of global separation. But the Earth knew. And it continued to pull, slowly, relentlessly, until the rift valleys were no longer just valleys. They widened. Seawater flooded in. The first shallow seas formed. And from that point on, Pangaea was no longer a single mass. During the Jurassic period, these rift valleys appeared on a vast scale, cutting across Pangaea like open scars. Rivers changed course, land subsided, and magma from deep within the earth rose along newly formed fractures, not in a single location, but across belts thousands of kilometers long. Lava erupted, flowed across the land, and cooled into dense black basalt layers. These flows did more than cover the landscape. They buried forests, rivers, and plains beneath thick rock, leaving geological signatures that humans would still be able to observe hundreds of millions of years later. This immense sequence of eruptions is now known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest magmatic events in Earth's history. At the time, it was not a single event that ended quickly, but a prolonged phase in which the Earth continuously released energy stored deep within itself. Ash and volcanic gases entered the atmosphere, altering sunlight temperature and rainfall, creating climatic shifts that were slow but profound. Ecosystems did not understand what was happening in any conscious sense, but they felt the consequences, each subtle change in heat, each redistribution of water. As the rift valleys continued to widen, they began to collect water. First, long, narrow saline lakes formed in new depressions. Then shallow bays emerged as seawater crept inland between separating landmasses. Over time, as stretching continued, these bays connected, and a new ocean was born. The early Atlantic Ocean did not appear overnight. It formed gradually, opening very slowly between drifting continental plates. As seawater entered, new ocean currents developed, redistributing heat from the equator along unfamiliar paths, changing how moisture moved through the atmosphere. Here, Earth's climate began to shift in new directions. Regions once dry became more humid. Areas once deep within continental interiors began to feel the influence of shallow seas and moist winds. Every small change in the continental map over millions of years created entirely new worlds. Some regions grew denser forests. Some plains expanded. Some ecosystems adapted or disappeared. During the Jurassic, there was no stable map for life to rely on. The planet's map was continuously redrawn, slowly, but without pause. What matters most is this: throughout this entire process, life did not control the planet. It did not command geology. It did not decide where land would split or sink. Life only responded. When the land cracked, species migrated or perished. When volcanic ash covered the ground, pioneer plants like ferns returned first, anchoring themselves in new soil, stabilizing surfaces, and opening pathways for others. When oceans expanded, marine life rapidly occupied new spaces, adapting to shallow, nutrient-rich waters. There was no grand plan, no final destination, only a continuous chain of interactions between rock, water, air, and life, each governed by simple physical and biological rules, yet together producing a world of overwhelming complexity. From this foundation, from the slow, relentless movements of the Earth, every later story of the Jurassic could unfold. Because when you later see vast herds of giant herbivores crossing forests, large predators stalking the forest edge, or tiny creatures surviving quietly in the shadows, you must remember, none of it could exist without this redrawing of the planet's map. No forests without the right climate. No climate without new oceans. No oceans without continental separation. And none of it without an Earth that never stopped moving beneath the feet of its inhabitants. The Jurassic did not begin with dinosaurs. It began in silence. With deep fractures in the ground, cracks that did not explode, did not scream, but opened quietly over time as the surface of the planet stretched. It began with fire, not flames raging across the land, but molten magma rising from deep within the earth, spreading cooling and becoming stone new layers, covering old ones, recording the slow breathing of the planet. It began with the sea, not vast oceans like those you know today, but the first saline waters seeping into newly formed fractures, reaching deep inland, creating warm, shallow seas where sunlight could touch the seafloor and life could expand. And above all, it began with an earth adjusting itself. No awareness, no intention, only physics, heat, and time working together under irreversible laws. Hold that image in your mind. Not a dramatic moment, but a process spanning tens of millions of years. A planet stretching itself slowly, continuously, with no way back. Each fracture opened redistributed land and water. Each cooling rock layer became a new foundation for forests, rivers, and life. Each shallow sea was an invitation for evolution to explore paths that had never existed before. It was within this context, as continents loosened their old shapes, as climate grew warmer and more stable, as vegetation spread across the planet, that the Jurassic began. Not as a door thrown open, but as a very slow dawn light, increasing little by little until the world had completely changed without anyone noticing the moment of transition. And upon that foundation of stone, sea, and time, one of the most vibrant eras in the history of life quietly began to take shape. In the next chapter, we will step onto the surface of that world, feel the air, the humidity, and the warmth, and understand why Earth, during the Age of Dinosaurs, could become a planet warm enough, green enough, and stable enough to sustain life on a scale never seen before. When the Jurassic truly began, the world did not change through violent jolts or sudden upheavals, but through a shift so slow it was almost invisible. A gentle slide of the planet's entire system into a new state where Earth's rhythm became steadier, warmer, and more stable for a span of time rare in geological history. There were no icebound winters sealing continents beneath frozen silence. No permanent ice caps at the poles, and no harsh cold cycles forcing life to contract just to endure. Instead, Earth entered what scientists call a greenhouse world, a warm, humid, biologically energetic planet where cold rarely became an existential threat. That warming was not random, and it was not a geological accident. It was the direct result of processes that had begun long before, when the supercontinent Pangaea cracked and stretched apart, when magma rose through deep rift valleys in Earth's crust, and when basalt flows spread for thousands of kilometers across the planet's surface. Each eruption released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and unlike short-lived fluctuations, that gas did not vanish quickly. It accumulated over time, forming an invisible blanket around Earth, trapping the sun's heat, and raising global average temperatures slowly but persistently, not on the scale of years or decades, but on the scale of hundreds of thousands and millions of years. In such a world, climate no longer swung violently with the seasons in the way modern humans have grown accustomed to. There were no abrupt pivots from hot to cold, no sharp boundaries between seasons that forced life to constantly readjust just to survive. Instead, there was a slow, even predictable rhythm where the differences across the year expressed themselves mainly through humidity in the air, through rainfall that was heavier or lighter rather than through severe shifts in temperature. You can imagine mornings without frost spread over the ground, nights without the skin-cutting cold that compels living things to seek shelter, and weather cycles repeating with enough stability that plants and animals could build long lives without existing in a permanent state of vigilance. Even near the poles, places that in the modern world are sealed beneath permanent ice and long darkness, the Jurassic wore a completely different face. There, sunlight still fell upon dense forests, where ancient conifers rose into moist air, their trunks thick and enduring their crowns layered into green vaults reaching all the way to the horizon. Beneath those canopies, vegetation grew thick and continuously renewed, unbroken by snow or deadly winters, forming ecosystems with biological productivity far beyond anything Earth had seen in earlier eras. These were forests that did not merely survive. They expanded, spread, and sustained life at large scale for long spans of time. Rain in the Jurassic did not fall in violent bursts and then vanish, leaving behind long stretches of dryness. It arrived as a steady component of the planet's global climate rhythm. Rains came regularly, repeating in stable cycles, spreading across continents, keeping the land surface moist enough for plants to grow continuously. High humidity reduced rapid evaporation, so water was not lost immediately after each rainfall. Instead, it seeped gradually into the ground, nourishing aquifers and maintaining long-lasting sources of water for rivers, wetlands, and swamps. The rivers of the Jurassic, therefore, were no longer temporary flows that appeared only in part of the year. They became stable systems persisting across many generations of life. They meandered slowly through vast floodplains carrying silt and minerals from upstream, laying them down in thin layers through each rainy season, each gentle flood cycle. Over time, those sediments accumulated, enriching the soils and forming fertile floodplains, places where plants could root deeply, where ecosystems could be renewed continuously without being erased by frequent climatic catastrophe. It was this prolonged stability that created an almost quiet feeling in the Jurassic world, not the stillness of absent movement, but the stillness of a system running smoothly, where water, soil, and climate cooperated in a durable cycle. In such an environment, life did not need to flee from weather, did not need to shrink inward and wait out brutal phases, but could expand, increase in size, and experiment with new survival strategies. And it was from these moist, stable, energy-rich lands that the foundation for the rise and dominance of gigantic terrestrial life was laid quietly yet firmly. In those lowlands, plant life exploded on a scale never seen before. Ferns were no longer merely a modest floor beneath the forest canopy. They became immense green fields. Cycads and ginkgos grew thick, their leaves dense, and their structures efficient at holding water. Ancient conifer forests rose so high that sunlight could reach the ground only through thin streaks that moved slowly with the wind. And although there were still no flowers and no grasses as we know them today, the plant biomass of the Jurassic reached an abundance rare in Earth's history, enough to sustain bodies that were larger, slower, and consuming energy in ways utterly different from the strategies of earlier eras. Plants did not only cover the land, they also gradually enriched the very atmosphere surrounding the planet. Through photosynthesis, over tens of millions of years, oxygen continued to be released and maintained at high levels, not as a brief peak followed by decline, but as a stable, long-lasting baseline, strong enough to shape how life itself functioned. Oxygen was not merely a component of air. It was fuel for metabolic reactions, an element that allowed cells to extract more energy from the same amount of food, and that in turn opened the possibility for larger bodies to exist slower, yes, but powerful and enduring. Within that energetic atmosphere, plant life did not remain a single monotonous green mass. It diversified in form and size and in survival strategy. Ancient conifer forests were not made of only a handful of dominant species. They were assemblages of many different tree forms, each occupying its own layer in the forest's vertical space. Beneath the high canopy were lower trees, then shrubs, then ferns, and ground cover, creating a multi-layered structure where light, moisture, and nutrients were distributed in different ways. Each layer was a small world of its own, offering habitat to different kinds of creatures, from insects and small animals to massive herbivores moving slowly through gaps between the trees. The diversity of plants drew forth the diversity of animals almost inevitably. When food became abundant and stable, animals were no longer forced into brutal competition simply to exist. Instead, they could specialize, dividing ecological roles and adapting to different resources. Some herbivores focused on low vegetation, grazing ferns and tender shoots. Others developed long necks or tall postures to reach leaves higher up. Meanwhile, smaller animals lived hidden in shrubs and undergrowth, eating seed sprouts or insects among the decaying leaf litter. Each feeding strategy became its own evolutionary branch, adding richness to the Jurassic's biological tapestry. In that setting, a critical biological threshold was crossed. In earlier eras, large size often meant danger. Too much food required difficulty moving, vulnerability when environments shifted suddenly. But when plants blanketed continents, when climate was stable, and when abundant oxygen supported more efficient metabolism, large size increasingly became a clear evolutionary advantage. A large body could process vast quantities of food, maintain a steadier internal temperature, and face fewer threats from most predators. This does not mean every creature became gigantic. It means gigantism became a viable option, opening entirely new evolutionary pathways. The Jurassic's biodiversity, therefore, was not confined to the giants humans tend to remember. It also lived in countless smaller species, quietly exploiting the ecological spaces created by this new system. Insects diversified to feed on different leaves, woods, and plant debris. Small animals adapted for climbing, burrowing, or nocturnal life. Predators differentiated by size and strategy, from ambush hunters in dense forests to runners in open areas. All of them existed within a complex web where energy flowed from sunlight into plants and then outward into every corner of the ecosystem. In such a world, abundance was not the product of sudden miracle, but the natural consequence of time stability and plentiful resources. When Earth was patient enough to sustain plant life over tens of millions of years, when the atmosphere was rich enough to support high-energy living life, responded by expanding, diversifying, and testing every viable form of existence. And upon that broad biological foundation, the largest animals stepped onto the stage not as fragile exceptions, but as the logical result of a world ready for them. In earlier periods, carrying a gigantic body always came with risk, too much food required, too much energy demanded, and vulnerability to abrupt climatic swings. But the Jurassic was different. A stable climate, abundant vegetation, and expanding continental prostranstva allowed herbivores to grow slowly, yet continuously, feeding for long periods, storing energy, and increasing in size year by year, without being forced to move constantly to outrun hunger. A large body now helped retain heat, reduce the threat from predators, allowed access to higher layers of leaves, and opened a life strategy based on endurance and stability rather than speed and evasiveness. Alongside these changes on land, the oceans too entered a phase of deep transformation. As continents separated, shallow inland seas formed warm, mineral-rich, flooded with sunlight, becoming enormous biological factories that nourished algae, plankton, and complex food chains. Fish, marine reptiles, and invertebrates diversified rapidly, while dead organisms sinking gradually pulled carbon down into seabed sediments, locking it away and helping regulate the atmosphere over long cycles, making Earth's climate system even more stable. The Jurassic was not a perfect paradise, and it was never a world without danger. Drought still occurred in interior regions far from the sea, where rain could remain scarce for long stretches. Floods still arrived when rivers spilled over after prolonged rainy seasons, carrying mud, uprooted trees, and sometimes creatures unable to escape in time. Volcanoes still erupted, sometimes quietly, laying out slow rivers of hot rock, sometimes more violently, covering forests and plains in ash. Jurassic Earth was still a living planet, and because of that, it still carried risks that could not be eliminated. But what made the Jurassic different was not the absence of upheaval. It was the way upheaval happened. Compared to earlier eras when climate and geography could shift so quickly that entire ecosystems were erased in short spans of time, Jurassic disruptions tended to unfold more slowly, more locally, and were rarely intense enough to destroy life on a wide scale all at once. A drought might dry out water in one region while other regions remained wet. A volcanic eruption might bury one forest, yet only a few hundred kilometers away, ecosystems continued to function almost uninterrupted. It was precisely this fragmentation, this local partial nature of disaster, that allowed life to learn recovery. Plants regenerated from seeds and roots left in the soil. Animals migrated to safer areas and returned when conditions improved. Ecosystems were not forced to begin again from zero. They only needed to adjust to refill newly opened gaps. Over time, this capacity for recovery became a core feature of the Jurassic world, helping life maintain continuity across tens of millions of years. And that slow rhythm, the rhythm of geology, climate, and biology braided together, was the most important factor of all. Large life cannot persist in a world constantly broken by abrupt interruption. Gigantic bodies need many years to mature. They need consecutive generations that are not wiped away so favorable traits can be sustained and refined. A constantly shattered environment favors small, fast-breeding creatures with immediate adaptability. By contrast, a long, stable environment opens the door to life strategies built on size, longevity, and endurance. In the Jurassic, stability did not mean immobility. It meant change happening slowly enough that living things had time to respond. When climate became warmer or wetter, that shift unfolded across many generations, allowing plants and animals to adjust their ranges, their behaviors, and their body forms. When sea levels changed, shallow seas expanded or contracted, gradually creating new opportunities rather than sudden biological shocks. All of this together produced a world in which life did not have to flee from the future. It could build it step by step. For that reason, the Jurassic was not an era of perfect peace. It was an era of Earth's patience, a planet allowing ecosystems to persist long enough to become complex, stable enough to become large and flexible enough not to collapse when tested. It was in this context that the giants could appear not as fragile anomalies, but as the inevitable outcome of a world that had learned to change slowly. The Jurassic provided exactly that: a stable thermal baseline, a powerful water cycle, an expanding continental surface, and an unprecedented abundance of biological energy. When you picture Earth in this period, think of a planet breathing evenly, unhurried, not brutal, and patient enough to nourish creatures that would transform our very idea of size and biological power. Upon that climate foundation, the story of the true giants is about to begin, and their heavy footsteps are preparing to imprint themselves upon a world already made ready to receive them. If the Jurassic had a true heart, it was not the gigantic creatures people often remember when they speak of this age. It was the forest. Not a single forest, not a few scattered bands of trees along riverbanks, but forest systems stretching across much of the planet's land, linking one continent to another in a continuous green network, dense, enduring, and resilient. Before dinosaurs dominated the surface of Earth, the forests were already there, and it was the forests that prepared every condition needed for enormous bodies to appear and to persist over long spans of time. Jurassic forests were unlike any modern forest you have ever known, and that difference was not contained in one isolated detail, but in the entire sense of time the forest carried within it. There were no brilliant seasonal flowers opening to attract pollinating insects. There was no soft grass spreading into an unbroken carpet underfoot. There were none of the familiar colors the modern eye instinctively searches for when imagining a forest. The green world of the Jurassic was built from far more ancient plant groups. Evolutionary lineages formed hundreds of millions of years earlier, when life on land was still experimenting with its first possible forms of existence. And now in warm, humid, stable climates, those lineages reach their greatest scale, their greatest density, and their most durable persistence. Ancient conifers were the pillars of that forest. They rose high with straight, rigid trunks, their bark thick in layers, protecting them from insects, fungi, and the slow changes of the environment, while their needle-like or scale-like foliage was shaped to reduce water loss and to endure long stretches of humid heat. These canopies did not spread wide in the manner of modern broadleaf trees. Instead, they stacked into thick layers, forming a continuous vault that filtered sunlight into muted bands, drifting very slowly across the forest floor, leaving the space beneath always held in a deep, subdued green. Beside the conifers were cycads plants that seemed almost motionless before the flow of time. Cycad trunks were often low, solid, and heavy, bearing the marks of many years of slow growth, while their large, stiff, glossy leaves spread outward in circular crowns able to endure both harsh light and prolonged shade. Cycads did not grow quickly, but they endured. They could live for centuries, watching generations of animals pass through the forest while remaining in the same place. They represented a strategy of life not built on speed or fierce competition, but on stability and long-term resistance. Between the tall conifer trunks and the solemn clusters of cycads stood ginkgos and other gymnosperm groups, each carrying its own form, its own way of occupying space in the forest. Ginkgos, with their fan-shaped leaves, spread horizontally to catch light in the middle layers, while other gymnosperms developed along different architectural paths, filling gaps that dominant species did not reach. This diversity did not create a chaotic forest. It created a subtle structure where each plant could persist by avoiding direct competition, by choosing its own layer, its own angle of light, and its own distinct strategy of growth. What is striking is that Jurassic forests were not built to change quickly. Most of their plants grew slowly, regenerated slowly, and responded to the environment on the scale of decades or centuries, not seasons. It was this slow rhythm that gave the forest an almost motionless feeling, as if you were standing in a landscape untouched by short-term time, where every trunk and every canopy was the result of a very long accumulation. Lower down, where light fell only in small patches, ferns and other soft-stemmed plants covered the ground, spreading through the open spaces between roots and fallen logs. They did not rise upward and compete for the sky. They expanded outward, holding moisture in the soil, protecting the organic layer beneath, and creating a continuous biological foundation. It was this foundation that helped the forest retain humidity, stabilize temperature, and sustain the nutrient cycles on which the entire ecosystem depended. Jurassic forests, therefore, were not random collections of trees. They were living structures built over long-time systems in which each plant group played a specific role in keeping everything running smoothly. From tall trunks capturing light to slow-growing forms rooted in shade all together, they created a green world with depth, stable, enduring, and rich enough in energy to become the foundation for every form of large life that would appear later. The structure of Jurassic forests was distinctly layered. At the highest level was the canopy, where the tallest trees competed for sunlight, their crowns overlapping into a thick green roof that allowed light to reach the ground only as thin streaks drifting slowly with the wind. Beneath the canopy was a middle layer where smaller trees and young growth relied on rare pockets of brightness to develop. And near the ground was the low layer where ferns, mosses, and other soft plants spread densely, holding moisture in the soil and forming a continuous mass of biomass without interruption. It was this low layer that served as the quiet foundation of the entire ecosystem. Fallen leaves, broken branches, and dead trunks accumulated over time, forming a thick humus layer, rich in organic matter where microbes and decomposer fungi worked without pause. This process of decay released nutrients back into the soil, feeding the next generation of plants and ensuring the material cycle never truly stopped. Jurassic forests were therefore not only places where plants grew, they were gigantic biological machines, continuously recycling light, water, and minerals into new biomass. Within this environment, the forest did not stand still. It changed slowly through time, opening and closing gaps when large trees fell through old age, strong winds, or unstable ground. These openings allowed sunlight to pour down, triggering bursts of young growth, creating patches of forest in different stages of development existing side by side. This unevenness dramatically increased biodiversity because each stage of forest growth offered different living conditions for different organisms. Jurassic forests were not only spaces of plants, and they were certainly not a quiet backdrop behind the story of large creatures. They were living worlds at every height, every depth, and every scale, worlds where life was so dense that almost no place was truly empty. Each layer of the forest, from the highest canopy down to the damp humus underfoot, was filled with organisms exquisitely adapted to the Jurassic's warm, humid stability. Insects were the most abundant residents of that forest, present everywhere, yet rarely noticed. They lived thickly in leaf litter, decomposing slowly in hollow, rotten trunks invaded by fungi, and among layers of foliage where light filtered down only in thin streaks. Some species fed on young leaves and new shoots. Others consumed fungi and microbes, breaking down decaying wood. Many hunted other insects. Through countless short life cycles repeating again and again, insects became a continuous bridge of energy between plants and larger animals, converting plant biomass into forms of food accessible to predators higher in the food chain. The sound of the Jurassic forest, if you stand still and listen, came largely from these small creatures. The faint flutter of wings in humid air, the soft friction of insect bodies brushing leaves, and movements almost too quiet to hear. Within the humus, all formed a steady acoustic layer, a background that was never truly silent. For many other animals, those subtle sounds were signals of life's presence of food and also of danger. Around small swamps and slow-moving streams beneath the canopy, amphibians found ideal conditions to exist. High humidity and stable temperatures allowed them to reproduce without facing long periods of drought or cold. Eggs were laid in shallow water, tadpoles developed slowly, and the life cycle unfolded in a world with almost no major interruption. Amphibians fed on insects' larvae and other small organisms, and in turn they became prey for larger hunters, helping maintain the balance of energy within the forest ecosystem. Small reptiles were also present throughout Jurassic forests, but in quieter ways. They moved along tree trunks, hid among peeling bark, snapped up insects in quick bites, and then vanished into natural cracks before predators could notice. Some species lived close to the ground, warming themselves in rare patches of sunlight slipping through the canopy. Others adapted to climbing, using the forest's three-dimensional space to avoid competition and danger. This specialization allowed many reptiles to coexist without direct conflict, each occupying a very narrow but stable ecological niche. At the very lowest layer of the forest, where light was weak and moisture high, countless other small creatures, from earthworms to invertebrates living within the humus, participated in decomposition and recycling. They broke fallen leaves and decaying wood into smaller fragments, enabling microbes to complete the final work and return nutrients to the soil. Because of these small organisms, the forest did not bury itself beneath its own dead matter. It was renewed from within, sustaining its ability to support life over a long time. All of these organisms, no matter how small, were connected in a dense network where every action, a leaf eaten a trunk, hollowed an insect, captured scent effects outward into the surrounding system. Jurassic forests were not shaped by a few standout species. They were the result of countless small interactions occurring continuously, silently, and persistently. It was upon this living foundation that larger animals could enter, not to replace what existed, but to become part of a system that had been running smoothly for a very long time. Medium-sized herbivores moved through the forest's open spaces, grazing on young leaves, new shoots, and ferns. They did not destroy the forest. They interacted with it in ways that adjusted the structure of vegetation. Through selective feeding, trampling, and trail making, they altered the distribution of saplings, opened new pockets of light, and prevented certain plant groups from becoming absolutely dominant. Jurassic forests, therefore, were not static systems, but dynamic landscapes continuously reshaped by the very organisms living within them. And then upon that foundation, large herbivores began to appear with increasingly important roles. As body size increased, their relationship with the forest also changed. A large animal does not merely consume plants, it interacts with the forest's entire structure. As it moves, it breaks branches, knocks down small trees, and opens corridors of light. As it feeds, it can reach higher layers of foliage, exploiting food sources smaller animals cannot access. And as it defecates, it returns large amounts of nutrients to the soil, disperses seeds over greater distances, and helps expand the range of plants. Jurassic forests, therefore, did not only nourish large animals, they were shaped by those animals in return. This was a two-way relationship where forests created the conditions for gigantic bodies to arise, and gigantic bodies helped maintain the forest's structure and vitality. Over time, this relationship became stable and self-reinforcing, allowing both to persist for tens of millions of years without collapsing. Light within Jurassic forests carried its own rhythm. By day, sunlight filtered through the canopy, forming patches of brightness and shadow that moved slowly with the sun's position. By night, the forest did not fall into total darkness because stable temperatures and high humidity allowed many creatures to remain active. Insects produced steady sound amphibians called for mates, and small animals moved through leaf litter, creating an acoustic floor that was never truly silent. The forest also played a crucial role in regulating local climate. The canopy held moisture, reduced the temperature swing between day and night, and slowed the flow of rainwater, preventing soil erosion. Water seeped gradually into deeper layers, feeding roots and maintaining steady stream flow. In this way, the forest became a natural buffer, reducing the impacts of drought and flood, helping sustain the stability upon which the entire Jurassic ecosystem depended. Most importantly, Jurassic forests endured long enough to become a foundation for long-term evolution. Ancient trees lived through many generations of animals, providing a relatively stable environment in which species could gradually adapt toward large-size, long lifespans and survival strategies based on endurance. Without these forests, without continuous food supply, without local climate regulation, without durable nutrient cycles, the giants of the Jurassic would never have had the chance to appear. When you imagine Jurassic forests, do not picture them as a static backdrop for dinosaur stories, but as the central character of the entire era. It was the forest that shaped how life was distributed, how energy moved, and how evolution unfolded on land. Before the heavy footsteps of giants shook the ground, the forest had already prepared a world wide enough, rich enough, and patient enough to receive them. And from within those forests where light water and time merged into a slow rhythm, the story of the largest creatures ever to walk on land is about to truly begin. The Jurassic forest, for all its richness and stability, did not exist in an unchanging state. However solid and ancient it might appear, that forest was continuously reshaped by the creatures living within it, and no force altered the landscape more powerfully than the gigantic herbivores, the sauropods. They were not merely passive consumers of vegetation. Through the way they fed, moved, and lived, they became ecosystem engineers, quietly building and rebuilding Jurassic landscapes day after day, generation after generation. In modern science, the term ecosystem engineer refers to organisms capable of modifying their habitat in ways that affect many other species. In the Jurassic, that role belonged to the sauropods, the colossal plant-eating dinosaurs of the suborder Sauropoda, the largest animals ever to walk on land. With massive bodies, long necks, and long tails, they moved through forests and floodplains like living structures, and every action they took left broad ecological traces. First comes feeding an action that seems simple, but in the Jurassic world carried the weight of geology. A sauropod did not snack, and it did not pause to select individual leaves with delicate precision. It fed in the rhythm of its own immense body, steady, persistent, and stretched across long hours of the day. A large mouth teeth suited for stripping and gathering biomass, and a long neck capable of reaching multiple vegetation layers, turned feeding into a continuous flow rather than a series of separate motions. Each day, an adult individual could consume hundreds of kilograms of plant matter, conifer needles, young shoots, ferns, small branches depending on the species size and habitat. And it is precisely this volume that helps us understand why their feeding did not destroy the forest, but restructured it. Consuming at such scale did not mean sweeping everything away. On the contrary, it created a grazing pressure distributed through time strong enough to prevent certain plant groups from becoming absolutely dominant, but not so violent as to collapse the entire green carpet. When foliage was reduced, especially in areas herds moved through, repeatedly sunlight began to reach the ground, more often, not as harsh blazing patches, but as bands of light gradually widening day by day. That light awakened seeds lying dormant in the soil, triggered the sprouting of saplings and ferns, and restarted growth cycles that had been suppressed beneath dense canopy. In this way, sauropods created ecological opening spaces just open enough for new life to appear, yet still sheltered by the surrounding forest. These openings were not fixed. They shifted with the feeding routes and movements of the herds, turning the forest into a dynamic picture in which patches at different stages of growth existed side by side. Where vegetation had just been grazed, fresh growth surged. Where recovery had progressed, larger plants reclaimed space. And where no disturbance had occurred, dense canopy continued to hold moisture and stabilize the local microclimate. This interweaving sharply increased diversity because each forest stage offered different food sources and different forms of shelter to other organisms. Sauropod feeding also distributed pressure vertically. Some long-necked forms reached into high foliage, reducing pressure on the lower layers. Other species swept across middle or low levels, preventing fern carpets and undergrowth from expanding too aggressively. Because of this vertical partitioning, the forest was not stripped at a single height. Instead, it was adjusted across its entire vertical structure. The result was a woodland that was open but not empty, dense but not sealed, optimized for the flow of light, water, and nutrients. What is remarkable is that the grazing rhythm of sauropods matched the regeneration rhythm of the forest. Jurassic plants, especially ferns and many gymnosperms, often had strong recovery capacity. Fresh shoots could rise quickly when light increased, and resilient root systems allowed regrowth after browsing. Grazing pressure, therefore, did not become a catastrophe. It became an ecological signal that encouraged plant life cycles. Over long spans of time, the forest and sauropods co-adjusted. The forest provided enough biomass to sustain enormous bodies, while sauropods kept the forest in its highest productivity state. In the end, it helps to see feeding not as a moment, but as a timeline. Every stripped leaf opened a path for light. Every small opening accumulated into larger change. And every day of repeated grazing over millions of years rewrote landscape structure. There was no loud destruction, no sudden collapse, only a durable adjustment, slow enough for the forest to keep pace, and strong enough to push the ecosystem into a more stable state. Differences among sauropods make that effect even clearer. Diplodocus, with its long neck, slender body, and extremely long tail, likely tended to sweep and browse low to mid-levels, creating corridors through undergrowth. Apatosaurus, broader in build and heavier, interacted strongly with lower vegetation and shrubs. Meanwhile, Brachiosaurus, with forelimbs longer than hind limbs, reached into higher canopy layers, exploiting food sources few others could touch. Each body plan represented a feeding height strategy, reducing direct competition and distributing grazing pressure across multiple forest layers. Next comes movement, a motion inseparable from mass. A herd of sauropods crossing a forest and floodplains could not walk lightly, and it did not need to. Every footfall carried enormous weight, compressing surface soils and altering ground structure in a way that was slow and durable, yet difficult to reverse. Young trees were pressed aside, fern beds, flattened leaf litter compacted, and through repetition, stable pathways gradually formed. At first, they were only faint strips of compacted ground, easy to miss. But over time, when herds returned seasonally following food sources and water routes, those strips became ecological trails. Not straight roads built by human design, but winding bands shaped by terrain, avoiding deep swamps, skirting forest edges, and crossing openings where light had already been created. These trails did not belong only to sauropods. Medium-sized herbivores used them to move more efficiently. Predators followed them to track prey. And even smaller creatures took advantage of these openings to conserve energy in a world otherwise dense with vegetation. On floodplains where soils were soft and sediments were constantly deposited, the effects of footsteps were even more pronounced. Soil compaction created shallow grooves that guided rainwater along more fixed routes. Water gathered in low spots seeped slowly into the ground and supported moisture-loving vegetation, while slightly higher ground dried faster, favoring different plant communities. This produced microtopography, small differences in elevation moisture, and soil structure, subtle yet sufficient to create multiple microhabitats at small scales. Within a short distance, shallow swamp, muddy flat dry ridge, and fern bed could exist side by side, each drawing its own collection of organisms. Movement, therefore, was not merely travel from point A to point B. It was a quiet process of shaping in which enormous bodies acted like tools of landscape formation, redistributing water sediment and ecological opportunity. Forests and plains were not leveled. They were carved gently but steadily by routes repeated across long spans of time. Then comes defecation, a process often overlooked, yet one of the vital pulses of ecological cycling. Sauropod dung was not merely waste, it was a mobile store of nutrients. Because feeding could be rapid while digestion was prolonged, a large portion of organic material left the body not fully broken down. When deposited, that mass struck the ground as a biological hotspot, rich in carbon, rich in minerals, and moist. Immediately, microbes began their work. Bacteria and fungi spread into the dung, breaking down complex structures and releasing nutrients gradually. Insects arrived, beetles' larvae to feed and burrow, mixing the dung with surrounding soil. Layer by layer nutrients were returned to the topsoil where plant roots could access them. Not as a sudden harsh fertilization, but as a slow release aligned with the growth rhythm of the Jurassic forest. Within that process, seeds played a quiet but decisive role. Many seeds passing through the digestive tract were carried far from the parent plant, far beyond what simple falling or wind could achieve. When deposited, they rested in a nutrient-rich, moisture-friendly environment with less immediate competition. Germination rates increased not by magic, but by favorable starting conditions. Over time, saplings rose along movement routes around resting areas and within openings created by the sauropods themselves. In this way, sauropods both consumed the forest and reseeded the forest. They removed biomass in one place and returned nutrients elsewhere. They opened paths with their feet and scattered new life along those paths. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. Forests fed sauropods, and sauropods kept forests productive, diverse, and flexible. More important still was the rhythm of that cycle. There was no explosive peak followed by collapse, no abrupt interference. Everything unfolded slowly enough for ecosystems to adjust evenly enough for benefits to accumulate over long spans of time. In that slow rhythm, the landscape was built again each day through feeding footsteps and return until it became a system, stable, energy-rich, and resilient over millions of years. That influence did not occur in a single day or season. It accumulated over millions of years. Jurassic landscapes, forests, floodplains, riverbanks carried the imprint of continuous sauropod presence. Studies of sediments and footprints reveal trackways where adults and juveniles traveled together, suggesting herd life. Herding was not only a defensive strategy, it amplified ecological impact. Many large bodies moving and feeding together produced disturbance large enough to restructure environments across broad areas. Within that context, Jurassic forests were not conquered by sauropods. They co-evolved with them. Plants adapted to grazing pressure through thicker leaves, chemical defenses, or rapid regrowth strategies. In return, sauropods adapted to food distributed across vertical layers, longer necks, larger guts, more efficient fermentation-based digestion. The result was a dynamic balance forests rich enough to sustain giants and giants sufficiently light-handed in an ecological sense not to collapse the forest. The impact of sauropods did not stop at vegetation or terrain. It spread throughout the food chain like slow waves radiating outward from an enormous point of contact. When they opened roots through dense forest and floodplains, when light gaps formed and fresh vegetation rose smaller, herbivores quickly exploited those opportunities. They gathered at nutrient-rich young growth, easier to digest than old leaves and hard branches, concentrating along the ecological corridors sauropods unintentionally created. That concentration did not occur for only a moment. Seasonally following the rhythm of plant regeneration, medium-sized herbivores returned to familiar openings, forming repeated movement paths. And where prey, concentrated predators, appeared no longer forced to chase through dense forest. They could wait along open routes where sightlines were longer and movement more predictable. In this way, sauropods did not directly feed predators, but they redistributed risk and opportunity through space, changing the hunting and defensive strategies of many other species. Near rivers, the influence extended into aquatic systems as well. Heavy footsteps disturbed shoreline sediments, breaking compacted mud layers and releasing nutrients into the water. Slight bank slumps created shallow zones where sunlight could reach the bottom, more easily stimulating algae and aquatic plants. This drew an increase in aquatic insects, small crustaceans, and fish or amphibians, feeding on them, creating biological hotspots along waterways. Creatures living at the boundary between water and land, amphibians semi-aquatic. Reptiles, ancient birds moved toward these areas to feed and breed. And again, predators followed. Food webs thickened, not by adding entirely new species, but by intensifying interactions in particular places. Energy no longer spread evenly across the landscape. It was concentrated and redistributed along structures sauropods helped shape. What is striking is that all of these consequences arose from actions that were fundamentally simple: eating and walking. There was no intent to build no conscious ecological strategy. But with enormous size and long-term repetition, those actions became organizing forces of the entire system. A small change in vegetation flowed upward to medium herbivores, then to predators. A disturbance of river sediment influenced bottom-dwelling life, then terrestrial animals dependent on that water. In this way, sauropods were not merely inhabitants of Jurassic ecosystems. They were initiators of cascading biological reactions, keeping energy moving, keeping survival relationships continually renewed. From a single heavy footstep, an entire living network could be adjusted slowly, continuously and persistently, creating a world in which every level of life was connected, even when the distance between those levels might be tens of meters in height, or millions of years in evolutionary time. The durability of this strategy cannot be ignored. The Jurassic lasted long enough for these slow influences to stabilize the landscape. There were not constant climate shocks that erased everything. Therefore, the ecological construction of sauropods had time to accumulate and be used by other species. Landscapes became open, but not empty green, but not absolutely dense, a state optimal for biodiversity. When you imagine a Jurassic morning picture, a herd of sauropods appearing at the forest edge. Their necks sway slowly above the canopy, leaves fall in soft showers, light spills onto the forest floor, insects surge, primitive birds and small reptiles exploit the bright patches. Rainwater follows compacted paths toward the river. There is no dramatic moment, only the steady rhythm of a system functioning as it should. What matters is this: sauropods did not need awareness to become ecosystem engineers. There was no plan, no goal, only biology and time. It was the persistent repetition of basic behaviors, feeding, walking, defecating, reproducing, that built the landscape in a way no other Jurassic organism could. And because they lived across multiple continents, their influence was global. In the end, remember that the ecological power of sauropods did not lie in violence or direct competition, but in mass and rhythm. They changed the world not through sudden blows, but through continuous presence, long enough for forests, rivers, and soils to learn how to operate with them. In that picture, sauropods were not solitary rulers, but pillars of an ecosystem already prepared for enormous bodies. And when the landscape had been built in that way, open, rich, stable, another force arrived to test it. The great predators of the Jurassic stepped in, not to break the balance, but to keep it moving. That will be the next story. If you stand still in a Jurassic forest, long enough, quiet enough, and patient enough, you will begin to notice that life here is not organized on a single plane. It is not a flat field where everyone fights over the same food. Instead, this world is built vertically by layers and by time, like a harmony in which each species occupies its own narrow band of sound. At the highest layer, where light is still strong and wind moves slowly between the crowns of ancient conifers, is the domain of long necks reaching toward the sky, the sauropods. But below them, far lower, a different picture is unfolding, more delicate, more flexible, and no less essential. This is the world of stegosaurs or nithopods, and a host of small to medium-sized herbivores creatures that do not rule by sheer size, but by precise adaptation. Stegosaurs are unlike any other herbivores, not only because they look strange, but because of how they exist in space. Their bodies are low and wide, their center of mass pressed close to the ground, as if they were born to belong to the forest floor itself. 4 short yet powerful limbs support a heavy frame that moves slowly and steadily, never hurried. They do not need to run fast. Their world is a world of endurance, of measured steps, repeated day after day, month after month. Along their backs rises a row of large bony plates standing upright like slabs of stone growing out of living flesh. These plates are not sharp, not made for stabbing or slashing, yet they make a stegosaur unmistakable in the Jurassic woods. Sunlight filtered through the canopy falls onto them and reflects off their surfaces, creating shifting patches of light and shadow that change with every step. Studies suggest these plates were richly supplied with blood vessels, hinting at a role in thermoregulation, helping the animal shed heat in the warm, humid Jurassic climate. But they were also visual signals for recognizing others of the same kind, for displaying size, and perhaps for warning predators that this was not an easy target. And yet the detail that shapes a stegosaur's entire way of life is much smaller: its mouth. Its head is small compared to its body, its mouth low, always angled toward the ground. Its teeth are simple, not built for crushing or processing tough plant matter. It does not need to. A stegosaur eats what is right in front of it: young ferns, soft stems, low leaves, fresh shoots, parts of the forest that regenerate quickly, hold a lot of water, and are easy to digest. It cannot reach the canopy, and it does not have to. By feeding only at the lowest layer, a stegosaur avoids direct competition with the towering long necks above. When sauropods pass through browsing higher levels and opening light gaps, stegosaurs arrive after them, not as scavengers of leftovers, but as finishers of the cycle. Light pouring onto the ground triggers ferns and saplings to explode in growth. And those fresh green carpets are the perfect meal for a stegosaur. Stegosaurs move through the forest like a low blade. They do not destroy large structures. They do not break trees. They simply adjust the density of the ground layer. In doing so, they prevent certain low plants from becoming overwhelmingly dominant, keeping the forest floor in a constantly active state. That in turn creates a more varied environment for insects, amphibians, and many other small creatures. Behind them, a stegosaur's tail carries an entirely different structure, 4 large, sharply pointed spikes that flare outward. This is not decoration. Fossil evidence suggests these spikes could inflict serious injuries on predators. But a stegosaur is not an aggressor by nature. The spiked tail is the last warning, used only when the animal is forced into danger. Most of the time, it relies on its bulk, its unusual silhouette, and the presence of its own kind to avoid conflict. Picture a stegosaur standing still in a Jurassic forest. Its breathing is slow, its body almost blending into the low vegetation. The plates along its back catch the light rising and falling with the quiet rhythm of life. It lowers its head and clips young ferns in steady bites. No hurry, no need to look up. High above, sauropods move like living towers. In the middle layer, ornithopods slip by more quickly, and the stegosaur remains exactly where it belongs. Not the tallest, not the fastest, not the most aggressive, but irreplaceable. In the multi-layered grazing picture of the Jurassic, the stegosaur is the low note, the stable foundation that keeps the forest from tipping into imbalance. And by living low, feeding slowly, and enduring, they helped the world of giants run smoothly for tens of millions of years. They moved slowly, often in small groups or family units, sweeping across the forest floor, like a low cutter, never demolishing the larger structure, only adjusting density. Their tail with 4 large spikes at the end, the thagomizer, was not for hunting, but for defense. A single swing could cause severe injury, and fossil evidence suggests that it did. But most of the time, stegosaurs did not seek confrontation. They survived by staying in their lair, eating what belonged to their lair, and withdrawing when necessary. In another layer of the forest, neither as high as the sauropod canopy, nor as close to the ground as the stegosaur world, lies the realm of ornithopods, animals that move between layers, between opportunities, and between environmental states. They are not locked into a fixed height. Their bodies seem built for constant adjustment, as if movement itself is the core of their survival. Ornithopods are more compact and lighter, with strong hind limbs. When needed, they can walk on all 4s to feed low, maintaining balance and conserving energy. But in an instant, when danger appears or when they want to reach higher, they can rise onto 2 legs. Their bodies straighten. Their field of view expands. That shift in posture is not merely a mechanical trick. It is a survival strategy, allowing them to feed, to scan the environment, and to react quickly. Their faces reflect that versatility. Their mouths are not small and specialized like a stegosaur's, nor as simple as those of older herbivores. Their jaws carry a more refined system, rows of tightly packed teeth, worn flat over time, forming a natural grinding surface. Old teeth fall away. New teeth grow in, continuously ensuring that their ability to process plant matter never truly collapses. This allows ornithopods to eat a broader range of vegetation, from soft young leaves to tougher, more fibrous parts that stegosaurs often ignore. They are not picky. In a forest that is constantly shifting, pickiness is a risk. Ornithopods eat ferns when ferns surge after rain. They nibble shoots when a new light gap opens. They chew smaller stems and older leaves when soft food temporarily runs thin. That flexibility makes them masters of opportunity, able to find something edible without waiting for the landscape to become perfect. One of the greatest advantages of ornithopods is the middle layer, the space between the ground and the canopy. This is a zone sauropods often ignore because it is too low for their towering necks, and it is also a zone stegosaurs cannot reach. When ornithopods rise onto two legs, they can browse low branches growing shoots and young leaves emerging from shade. This middle layer holds energy that is not fully exploited, and ornithopods are flexible enough to use it. Their movement is faster and lighter, and their rhythm differs from the other two herbivore groups. They can travel in loose herds, spaced far enough apart not to hinder one another, yet close enough to detect danger early. When a predator appears, the herd can break apart quickly, each individual darting in a different direction, disrupting the predator's plan. Speed and agility become the first layer of defense long before any direct confrontation is needed. Ornithopods therefore live in a perpetual state of transition. They are not bound to a fixed place like stegosaurs, and they are not chained to a massive daily intake like sauropods. They follow seasons' rainfall and plant regrowth. A forest patch today is only a stopover. Weeks later, they may have moved elsewhere, leaving behind vegetation that has been grazed but not destroyed. In the multi-layered grazing picture of the Jurassic ornithopods are the moving link connecting the low layer to the middle, connecting freshly opened gaps to forests in recovery. They help distribute grazing pressure more evenly across space and time, preventing any single region from being exploited too heavily in a short span. If the stegosaur is the stable low note and the sauropod is the massive foundational beat, then the ornithopod is the rhythm of motion, the force that keeps the entire harmony from going still. They do not dominate the landscape by size, but by presence everywhere, always there, always adapting, always ready to turn when the world turns. And it is through creatures like these that the Jurassic becomes not only an age of giants, but a world that is flexible, balanced, and enduring, where each layer of life has someone to carry its role quietly but indispensably. This creates a very clear vertical partitioning of herbivory: high-layer sauropods, low-layer stegosaurs, middle-layer and flexible ornithopods. Not because these animals agreed with one another, but because evolution removed those that competed too directly. Species that tried to eat the same thing in the same place at the same time were pushed out. Those that learned to settle into gaps by height, by plant type, by season were the ones that endured. Resource sharing happens not only in space, but also in time. A place that sauropods have stripped high foliage from today will not instantly attract stegosaurs or ornithopods. But months later, when ferns and saplings grow thick, that same place becomes a banquet for low-feeding herbivores. Then, as the ground layer is grazed back, woody saplings begin to rise again, and the cycle continues. In this way, the Jurassic landscape is not a place that gets eaten out. It is a surface constantly renewed where each species participates in a different phase of the same biological cycle. No one takes everything. No one is completely starved. And this is precisely what allows herbivore densities to remain high without collapsing the ecosystem. This vertical partitioning also shapes social behavior. Sauropods move in large herds because their size and feeding needs force them to keep searching for new sources. Stegosaurs with lower demands and rapidly regenerating food can live within smaller, more stable areas. Ornithopods sit between flexible, able to gather or split depending on predator pressure and food availability, and these differences force predators to adapt. An allosaur does not face herbivores as a single uniform mass. It must read which layer is most active, which species is concentrated, and where the greatest risk lies. An adult stegosaur is dangerous prey. A solitary ornithopod is more feasible. A juvenile sauropod, if separated from the herd, is a rare but enormous opportunity. So the multi-layered grazing picture is not only a story about plants, it is the foundation of the entire survival network. It determines where prey is when prey is there, and what risks come with it. No layer exists alone. Each layer supports the next, like the very structure of the forest itself. When you look at a stable Jurassic ecosystem, the most astonishing thing is not the size of its animals, but how perfectly it fits together. No species is extra, no layer is empty. From the highest canopy down to the dark, damp ground, sunlight is converted, divided, redistributed, and reused continuously, persistently, without spectacle. That is why the Jurassic could sustain gigantic life for tens of millions of years without destroying itself. Not because it lacked disturbance, but because its ecosystems learned how to share without direct conflict. And in that picture, stegosaurs and ornithopods are not minor characters standing behind sauropods. They are essential pieces keeping the harmony of life from slipping out of rhythm. In the next chapter, we will step to the other side of this picture, where pressure enters where every layer is tested, the predators and the way they shape behavior form, and fate across an entire green world. If the Jurassic world had only plants and herbivores, it could not have lasted for long. The green carpet would have been grazed down to exhaustion in the most favorable places. Herbivore herds would have expanded faster than the land could regenerate, and the ecosystem, however peaceful it seemed, would soon have collapsed under the weight of its own abundance. To prevent that, an opposing force was required, not a power of destruction, but a continuous pressure strong enough to regulate, steady enough not to shatter the whole system. In the Jurassic, that role belonged to the allosaurs. Allosaurs were not rulers in any absolute sense, and that is precisely what made them more formidable. They were not everywhere. They did not cast a single shadow across an entire continent, and they did not turn every Jurassic day into an unbroken chain of killing. And yet, wherever their footprints appeared, the way the world worked changed at once. Herbivore herds no longer lingered in one place for too long. Familiar routes were used more cautiously. Resting time shortened. And the young were kept in safer positions within the structure of the herd. The hunting pressure of an allosaur did not need to announce itself through constant attacks. It existed as a persistent possibility, an unseen danger that was always felt. Simply knowing that a large predator might be somewhere in the forest was enough to force other species to adjust their behavior. Vigilance became habit, and that habit repeated across generations became instinct. The allosaur's body reflects that role with precision. It was not built for absolute power, but for controlled movement. Two long, heavily muscled hind legs sat beneath the body's center of mass, allowing rapid acceleration over short distances, crucial in sudden chases. It did not need to run far. It needed to explode into motion at the decisive moment. A long tail extended behind, like a living balancing pole, keeping the body from pitching forward when sprinting or turning sharply. In abrupt changes of direction, when prey veered left, plunged into vegetation, or panicked into a sudden turn, that tail helped the allosaur stay stable, avoid slipping, avoid losing rhythm. It was the difference between an efficient predator and one that relied on strength alone. The allosaur's torso was not as massive as the giant predators that would appear tens of millions of years later. It did not carry an overwhelming bulk that weighed down every step. Instead, it was relatively light for its size, with a skeletal structure optimized for movement. This allowed it to navigate varied terrain, dense forest-flooded plains, riverbanks, without being overly constrained by its own weight. Its head was large, but not cumbersome. The skull contained openings and hollow spaces that reduced mass while preserving the strength needed for biting. Its jaws could open wide, suiting a strategy of biting and tearing rather than crushing. Its teeth were sharp and backward curving. Functioning like blades, once they sank in, they held flesh, and when the head pulled back, they carved deeper wounds. This was not a tool for instant killing, but for weakening, causing blood loss, draining strength, and pushing prey toward exhaustion. An allosaur was not a predator that depended on a single finishing blow. It was a predator of sustained pressure. Even an unsuccessful attack today could leave consequences, injury panic, or a moment of separation from the herd. And those consequences created opportunities for the next attempt for itself or for other predators. There was restraint in the allosaur's movement. It did not rush out before it had to. It watched, positioned, waited. When it struck, everything was fast, decisive, and focused on gaining advantage rather than displaying brute force. That is what made it part of the landscape rather than a force that broke the landscape. Other animals did not merely fear it, they lived with its presence. Imagine an allosaur standing still at the forest edge, almost blending into the shadows of the trees. Slow breathing, tail balancing, legs ready. It does not need to roar. It does not need to move. The simple fact that it could be there somewhere was enough to make the entire forest adjust its rhythm of life. And that is how the allosaur did not rule the Jurassic through constant violence, but through stable survival pressure. It did not stand above the ecosystem. It stood inside it like a tautness that kept everything from sliding too far away from balance. Its head was large, but not solid mass. Cavities and hollow chambers within the skull reduced weight while maintaining necessary strength. Its teeth, sharp and curving backward, were designed to slice and tear, not to grind. That reveals its hunting strategy, not an instant final bite, but wounds that bleed, weaken, and drain a victim over time. In a world where prey could outweigh the predator many times over, strategy mattered more than raw strength. But an allosaur was not only a solitary presence in the forest. Fossil evidence bone beds containing multiple individuals of the same species and interaction marks on bones suggest they tolerated one another's presence, at least under certain conditions. That does not mean tightly organized pack hunting like modern wolves, but it does hint at an ability to gather around large food sources, share space, and perhaps coordinate at a minimal level. The presence of allosaurs posed a constant problem for herbivores. Not how to never be hunted, but how to reduce the probability of being hunted. The answer was not a single tactic, but a diversity of behaviors. Sauropods clustered into large herds, where any one individual was less likely to be singled out, and the young were shielded in the center. Stegosaurs relied on passive defense-size armored backs and spiked tails, making an attack costly. Ornithopods chose another path: speed, alertness, and dispersion. All of those strategies were direct responses to predatory pressure. And for that reason, the allosaur influenced not only prey numbers, but the shape and behavior of prey over evolutionary time. Individuals that were slower, less vigilant, or positioned poorly within the herd faced a higher chance of being removed. Survivors passed on traits that helped them avoid danger. Over millions of years, that pressure honed entire populations. Allosaurs did not hunt at random either. They targeted weakness, the young, the old, the sick, or the separated. That had an important ecological consequence. It kept herbivore populations healthier on average because less fit individuals had a higher chance of being eliminated. This selection was not moral, it was mechanism. But the result was a more stable system, less prone to boom and crash. Along river edges, where animals gathered to drink, predatory pressure became even more pronounced. Allosaurs could conceal themselves in vegetation and wait for a moment when prey relaxed. That danger forced herbivores to adjust their routines, arriving in groups, choosing lower-risk hours, and not lingering too long. Even if no attack occurred, behavior was still reshaped. That is the power of predatory pressure. It acts, even when it does not act. Allosaurs were also opportunists, not in the sense of greed, but in the sense of realism. In a world where death arrived not only by teeth and claws, but through disease drought or silent accidents like slipping on a muddy riverbank, the ability to exploit carrion was a clear survival advantage. Ignoring readily available energy meant taking on unnecessary risk. Scavenging, therefore, did not oppose hunting. It complemented hunting, filling the gaps when healthy prey became scarce or difficult to access. When a carcass appeared, an old individual that did not survive the dry season, a juvenile that died of illness, an animal badly injured after a failed attack, the energy stored in that body did not vanish. It simply waited to be transferred. Allosaurs with keen senses and the ability to notice from afar could detect such opportunities early. They approached cautiously because a carcass is rarely safe. The smell draws competitors, the ground can be slick, an ambush is always possible. But once they gained access, they rapidly returned energy to the food web, not only for themselves, but for the entire surrounding network of life. That process carried deep ecological meaning. By clearing large carcasses, allosaurs reduced the time organic matter lay decomposing in the open, limiting outbreaks of harmful microbes, and preventing an uncontrolled buildup of odor that could attract insects at destabilizing scales. What remained, bones and fragments, became food for smaller species, for decomposer insects, and ultimately for the soil. Energy was broken down, distributed, and reused, rather than sitting and rotting in silence. But scavenging was also a crossroads of conflict. A large carcass could draw multiple allosaurs at once or attract other predators. Competition did not require theatrical roaring. A single step closer, a turn of the head, or a posture that claimed space could be enough to escalate tension. Those confrontations left marks on bone bites, scratches that millions of years later still tell the story of quiet struggles. Even without open conflict, danger was constant. A misstep in river mud while pulling flesh. A delayed reflex as another individual moved in. A sharp bone fragment slicing into soft tissue. In a world without medical care, small risks could become large problems. Fossils suggest as much. Many allosaurs show evidence of healed fractures, bones deformed by long-term uneven stress, or signs of chronic infection. Hunting, then, was not a chain of uninterrupted victories. It was a dangerous profession where every chase was a risk calculation. A counterstrike from a stegosaur armed with spiked tail could cause severe injury. A prolonged pursuit could exhaust the predator. A single wrong fall in the wrong place could leave lifelong consequences. Not every predator died in a dramatic instant. Many lived on with damage, forced to learn how to compensate for reduced ability. Those individuals adapted by changing strategy. They relied more on scavenging, chose easier prey, or avoided dangerous opponents. Injury did not make them useless. It adjusted their role within the ecosystem. And this flexibility shifting between hunting and scavenging is what allowed allosaurs to persist through difficult stretches when environmental conditions were less favorable. Zooming out, pressure did not fall only on prey, it weighed heavily on the predator as well. Allosaurs lived in a fragile balance where success today did not guarantee tomorrow. They had to continuously read the environment, read prey, read other allosaurs, and read their own bodies. Their existence was a string of small adjustments repeated again and again in a world that did not forgive mistakes. And precisely because allosaurs were not invulnerable, the ecosystem retained its elasticity. Predators were limited by risk injury and competition. They could not expand without bound. Prey were limited by predation pressure. They could not explode without bound. Between these poles, energy continued to circulate, redistributed, and reused, forming a rhythm that was slow but enduring. In the Jurassic picture, scavenging was not a minor behavior, and injury was not simply failure. Both were the other face of predatory life-quiet forces that prevented the system from sliding out of balance. Allosaurs endured not because they always won, but because they adapted when they did not. And that capacity made predation pressure stable, continuous, and sustainable across tens of millions of years. This produced a delicate equilibrium. Allosaurs could not increase without limit because their food prey depended on the very stability that predators helped maintain. If predators became too numerous, herbivore populations fell sharply, and allosaurs themselves would starve. If predators became too few, herbivores would surge, vegetation would be depleted, and eventually both sides would suffer. The system regulated itself through slow feedback loops, imperfect, never truly precise, but sufficient to persist over long spans of time. In the broader Jurassic world, allosaurs were neither devils nor heroes. They were timekeepers. Like a gentle but unceasing pull, they kept every component from drifting too far from balance. They forced other species to stay alert, to adapt, to continually adjust. Imagine a late afternoon in a Jurassic forest. The light softens. A herd of ornithopods moves a little faster than usual. Stegosaurs draw closer together. At the edge of vision, nothing is clearly visible, yet everything senses the possibility of presence. That is, the allosaur, it does not need to appear to shape the moment. And that is how, without noise, without constant action, the great predators of the Jurassic kept the world of giants from slipping into runaway excess. Without them, the layered herbivore picture would lose its counterweight. Without predation, pressure, large life would consume itself. In the next chapter, we will leave the ground behind and look up into the sky where another experiment is unfolding, quiet yet revolutionary. The emergence of flying creatures and the way they opened an entirely new ecological layer in the Jurassic world. If you stand still long enough in the Jurassic world, you begin to realize that not every change comes from the giants. Some of the most important transformations happen very quietly at the edge of your vision, in movements so small they are easy to miss. While sauropods shape the landscape, while allosaurs keep the tempo of balance on the ground, another story is beginning on a different layer, higher, more fragile. Not loudly, not as a ruler, but carrying a potential that will change the sky forever. This is the dawn of birds. For much of the Jurassic, the sky is not empty. Pterosaurs, flying reptiles, have occupied that space for a long time, with membrane wings stretched taut broad wingspans, and the ability to glide along coasts and over plains. But their presence does not prevent another experiment from unfolding deep inside the forest, between trunks, where the wind is weak and space is broken up by branches and leaves. There, a smaller group of creatures is approaching the sky in a completely different way. They do not stretch skin between fingers. They grow feathers. Before birds appear, feathers already exist. Many small theropods carry on their bodies structures like feathers, at first simple filament-like, able to retain heat and create visual display. In the warm but not perfectly uniform conditions of the Jurassic, the ability to regulate body temperature is a major advantage, especially for small, fast-moving animals living along the boundary between day and night. Over time, those single filaments branch, grow more complex, and begin to form surfaces that can interact with the air, not to fly immediately, but to control movement. Among these feathered creatures, Archaeopteryx appears not as a finished invention, not as the first bird in the modern sense, but as a transitional moment preserved in stone where multiple evolutionary routes still overlap. It does not belong entirely to either side. It stands in between, carrying the marks of the past and the seeds of the future together in one small body. The body of Archaeopteryx is light and slender, not built to endure heavy impacts or bear great weight, but to minimize its own resistance. Its skeleton is more hollow than that of many contemporary theropods, allowing it to remain rigid without accumulating too much mass. Every gram saved matters because in a world of leaps, glides, and uncertain landings, weight is the silent enemy. On the wings of Archaeopteryx are asymmetrical flight feathers, a small detail with enormous meaning. The feathers do not grow symmetrically around a shaft, like simple insulation. One side is wider, the other narrower, creating a surface that can interact with airflow. This suggests the wings are no longer only for display or warmth. They have begun to take on the role of steering movement, producing lift as air passes over them. Yet that lift is still limited, not enough for sustained flight. It serves short glides, controlled falls, moments of escape in the three-dimensional space of dense forest. But even with feathers, Archaeopteryx retains clear signs of its theropod ancestry. Inside its mouth are real teeth, not a beak. Those teeth allow it to bite, hold, and tear, suited to a diet of large insects, small animals, and perhaps scraps of meat from small carcasses. This is not a seed eater or a plant grazer. It remains a small predator, fast-moving, dependent on reflex and opportunity. On its wings, Archaeopteryx still bears claws, not meaningless leftovers, but real tools. These claws can grip bark branches or rock surfaces. They allow Archaeopteryx to climb hold position and prepare for a leap. This suggests much of its life takes place in vertical space, on trunks among leaf layers, rather than entirely on the ground or entirely in the air. Its tail is long, made of many consecutive vertebrae, not yet fused into the compact structure of modern birds. This tail is not a burden. It acts as a stabilizer. When jumping or gliding, it helps balance the body, adjust direction, and prevent uncontrolled spinning. In an environment full of branches and obstacles, the ability to stay balanced is as valuable as the ability to fly. Archaeopteryx, therefore, is not an animal of long flights. It is an animal of short but decisive moments of movement from one branch to another, from high to low, from danger to safety. Each successful glide is not merely travel, it is a narrow escape from death, from predators on the ground, from direct competition, from the dead-end limits of two-dimensional space. The most important thing about Archaeopteryx is not whether it can fly yet, but what it shows flight is not a sudden leap. It is the result of many small improvements, each one offering a modest advantage that accumulates over time. There is no moment when the world suddenly has birds. There are only creatures like Archaeopteryx different enough to survive, unfinished enough to keep evolving. In the Jurassic picture, Archaeopteryx does not shake the ecosystem. It does not restructure the forest. It does not shape the landscape, but it opens a possibility. A new path for life, a path upward, beyond the limits of the ground, beginning to exploit space that once belonged only to wind and light. And because this arrival is quiet, fragile, almost invisible among giants, it carries even deeper meaning. Archaeopteryx does not represent power. It represents subtle adaptability, something that over the long term can outlast size fangs and the authority of ground-dominating rulers. Archaeopteryx is not born to dominate the sky. It is born to experiment. Imagine the environment it inhabits: coastal forests with small islands, lagoons, and dense stands of trees. Distances between trunks are short. The ground is full of risk predators, tangled vegetation, constant competition. In that space, the ability to climb, jump, and glide briefly is a survival advantage. Archaeopteryx can use the claws on its wings to grip and climb a trunk. When it jumps down, its feathers spread, slowing the fall steering direction, extending the leap. That is not flight, but it is the stepping stone of flight. Each jump becomes a little safer, each landing a little more accurate, each escape a little faster. And in evolution, a little is enough. The feathers of Archaeopteryx do not serve movement alone. They retain heat, allowing the body to maintain high activity when light is weak. They create visual surfaces, perhaps for recognizing others, attracting mates, or threatening rivals. They help camouflage, breaking up the outline of the body among branches and leaves. One structure, many functions, true to evolution's logic: no waste, no instant perfection, only accumulated benefits across generations. In the food chain, Archaeopteryx is not at the top. It is a small predator and also a potential prey animal. It eats insects and small creatures and may scavenge small carcasses when opportunity arises. And because it occupies that middle position, selection pressure on it is intense. A small mistake can cost a life. So every improvement, even a tiny one, is preserved if it raises the odds of survival. The sky for Archaeopteryx is not a place to live. It is an exit. While pterosaurs dominate open air, wide skies over coasts and plains, where wind flows steadily and obstacles are few, Archaeopteryx and similar transitional forms find opportunity somewhere else entirely. Not high in the open sky, not inside broad currents, but in complex space where the sky is broken into pieces by trunks, branches, and overlapping shade. It is the world between tree and tree high, but not far, where every movement must be precise, where a single, misangled glide can mean a collision, a free fall, or becoming prey. In that space, the large membrane wings of pterosaurs, excellent for long glides and distance, become less agile. A wide sheet of skin is not easily adjusted in small sections. It does not adapt well to abrupt shifts in airflow warped by the canopy. Feathers, by contrast, open a different approach, not through brute force, but through fine control. Each feather can tilt, slightly lift, or settle, changing its angle against the air. A wing becomes not one unbroken surface, but a collection of small units working together to shape movement. In short jumps, sudden glides, or moments requiring an instant turn, that adjustability makes the difference between safety and disaster. Feathers allow Archaeopteryx not to fly far, but to fly correctly. Not to hold altitude long, but to control a fall. Not to conquer the sky, but to exploit the forest's three-dimensional space. It is a different kind of movement, less showy, less energy-hungry, but perfectly suited to tight, hazardous environments. And in that environment, there are no birds in the modern sense. No animal is born with fully developed wings, with massive chest muscles, with fused bones optimized for long flight. There are only creatures becoming birds, each generation moving one small step forward, so small that within a single lifetime you would barely notice. There is no predetermined goal, no blueprint being followed, no intention to fly inside evolution. There are only individuals that happen to have slightly longer feathers, slightly broader wings, slightly better balance in a leap. And when those tiny differences let them survive one more time, escape a predator reach food more easily, avoid a lethal fall, they remain. Not because they are right, but because they are not dead. Evolution does not ask, where will this lead? Evolution asks, only does this help you survive right now? And in the complex space of Jurassic forests, the answer becomes more and more often, yes. Each jump from branch to branch with a little less injury. Each fall to the ground with a little more control. Each mid-air turn that avoids collision. These improvements do not create birds immediately. They create only a little more flexibility. But that flexibility opens more survival situations, and across thousands, millions of generations, a little accumulates into a path. What matters is that this path is not the only one. Many transitional forms experiment in different directions. Some move farther toward flight, some stall, some go extinct. Archaeopteryx is not the direct ancestor of all modern birds. It is one branch within a vast web of experiments. But that branch shows what is possible, what can persist long enough to be refined. In that Jurassic moment, the sky has not changed. Owners. Pterosaurs still glide above. But below, among the canopy, a new ecological layer is forming, the layer of short, precise, flexible movement. Not loud, not dominant, but persistent. And because these becoming birds do not know what they will become, they are not constrained. They try every possibility their environment allows. Some fail, some succeed. But as long as enough individuals survive long enough, evolution continues to write the story not in huge leaps, but in adjustments so small they are almost invisible. That is how birds begin. Not with a grand triumphant takeoff, but with falls that are controlled a little better than yesterday. The appearance of Archaeopteryx does not transform the ecosystem overnight. Sauropods still pass through the forest. Allosaurs still hunt. Stegosaurs and ornithopods still share the green carpet. But a new layer has been added, the layer of three-dimensional movement. Insects are no longer safe simply by rising into the air. Small ground animals must watch above as well as below. And the sky, for the first time, does not belong only to flying reptiles. The point is not how long Archaeopteryx lives or how common it is. The point is what it proves is possible, that feathers can produce lift, that a small light body with a reorganized skeleton can interact with air in a new way. That flight does not have to be perfect at the beginning, it only has to be good enough to survive. And once that threshold is crossed, the path opens. After Archaeopteryx, other early bird forms appear, not all at once, not quickly, but steadily. Each generation refines a little more, a shorter tail, lighter bones, stronger chest muscles, better wing control. But it begins here at the moment. The boundary between reptile and bird becomes blurred. Not because classification fails, but because life does not care about boundaries. Imagine an early morning in a Jurassic forest. Light slips through a thin mist. Insects begin to move. On a low branch, an Archaeopteryx stands still. It does not sing. It does not flare its wings. It only watches. Then in a brief moment, it jumps, wings opening, feathers trembling, and it glides to the next branch. Not spectacular, not thunderous, but enough. In that moment, the sky gains a new resident, not to dominate, but to begin. And from that quiet beginning, tens of millions of years later, the world will be full of sound color, and flight. But here in the Jurassic, everything is still fragile. The dawn of birds is not blinding. It is faint, gentle, and easy to overlook, like the most important beginnings in the history of life. When people think of the Jurassic, the first images are always gigantic bodies, long necks rising above the canopy, tails sweeping across floodplains, footsteps that make the ground tremble. The scale is so overwhelming that it's easy to forget a foundational truth. Most of the life in this world is not in large size. It is in the small, hard-to-see, easy-to-ignore creatures, yet they are the ones who keep the system from ever stopping. If the giants are the skeleton of the Jurassic world, then the tiny ones are the blood circulating through it. At the lowest layer of the forest, where light is broken into glittering fragments, where thick leaf litter accumulates year after year, insects exist at a density the human eye can barely imagine. They crawl, fly, burrow, chew, and decompose without rest. There are no flowers, no grass carpets like today, and yet the Jurassic forest is still an ocean of biomass, and insects are the first to harvest every thread of energy within it. Beetles that feed on rotting wood break down the structure of dead trunks, opening the way for fungi and microbes to invade. But what matters is that they do not leave only empty space in the wood. They leave traces in stone. Tiny drill marks, networks of neat holes on fossilized trunks, mineralized cavities formed over time. These become direct evidence of how organic matter was processed. Because of those traces, paleobiologists do not have to imagine the role of decomposer insects. They read it from the wood itself, from small wounds preserved across hundreds of millions of years. Larvae living in soil and leaf litter leave their own history as well. Fossilized tunnels and sediment-mixing structures, called trace fossils, show that the ground was never motionless. It was continuously turned over, reworked, and aerated. From this, researchers can infer decomposition rates, nutrient cycles, and even the average moisture of Jurassic soils. Was the ground compacted or loose? Did water seep evenly or pool? These questions are answered not by dinosaur bones, but by the small tunnels of creatures few ever notice. Leaf-eating insects, through their own fossils and through bite marks on fossil leaves, allow us to measure herbivory pressure on a microscopic scale. Leaves pierced with holes chewed in repeated patterns clipped along the edges, these tell of a tense balance between plants and the animals that feed on them. From these damage patterns, scientists can determine not only whether leaf-eating occurred, but how much in which seasons, and whether certain plant groups once exploded in abundance or were held in check. In this way, Jurassic vegetation emerges as a continuously regulated system, not as an unorganized green sea. And when insects eat other insects, they leave traces that are indirect but consistent. The diversity of sizes, mouthparts, and wing forms in the fossil record reveals layered predator-prey networks. There is no single ruler at the insect level. Instead, there are multiple tiers controlling one another, where an increase in one group triggers responses in another. That multi-layered pattern, reconstructed from rich fossil assemblages, helps scientists understand why Jurassic ecosystems could remain stable for so long without collapsing into boom and bust cycles. Insect fossils and trace fossils therefore have done far more than help us list which species existed. They help reconstruct how the world functioned. They let us answer deeper questions. Where did energy go after leaves fell? How was the soil enriched? Was decomposition fast enough to sustain new plant growth? From these tiny fragments, science can connect the dots from leaf to insect to soil to forest and see the continuous flow of matter and energy. In other words, if dinosaur bones give us the shape of the Jurassic world, then insect fossils give us its heartbeat. They prove that stability does not come from heavy footsteps, but from countless small actions repeated long enough to become a foundation. And because of those small pieces of evidence, we understand that this world ran smoothly, not because of strength, but because of the endurance of creatures no one sees. Without insects, the cycle of matter would clog. Fallen leaves would accumulate. Dead wood would lie still. Energy would be locked inside plant remains and never return to the soil. But with insects, everything is broken down, divided, and fed back into the system, slowly, continuously, without spectacle. Insects are also a foundational food source. Early birds, small reptiles, amphibians, and tiny mammals all rely on them. An Archaeopteryx leaping from branch to branch does not do so, only to escape it does so to hunt insects. An amphibian waiting in a marsh survives on larvae skimming over the water. A small nocturnal mammal digs through leaf litter searching for beetles and worms. From creatures that weigh only a few grams, energy is pushed up through the entire food chain. Alongside insects are amphibians, residents of the boundary, living between water and land, between daylight and night, between fragile stability and the constant risk of disappearance. The Jurassic, with its prolonged warm humidity, evenly distributed rainfall, and relatively steady river systems, opened a rare window in Earth's history when that boundary became more livable than ever. In that world, amphibians were not temporary survivors, clinging on. They were long-term inhabitants of marshes, stream banks, shallow ponds, and slow channels winding beneath the canopy. Frogs and salamander-like forms reproduced in calm waters, where eggs were not swept away by flash floods, where tadpoles had time to grow in an oxygen-rich, food-rich environment. The slow rhythm of water allowed generation after generation to complete its life cycle without sudden interruption. And that continuity, no reset, no abrupt restart, is what amphibians need most. They cannot endure extreme shocks. They need steadiness, and the Jurassic provided it long enough for populations to stabilize and spread. In the food web, amphibians hold a distinctive position. They eat insects, larvae, small crustaceans, and invertebrates that live in water or along its edge. In doing so, they reduce the risk of insect booms in wet zones, places that without control can quickly lose balance. But amphibians do not clean out their food supply. They simply slow growth, keeping insect populations within a safe range of fluctuation. That measured regulation helps prevent ecosystems from overloading and then collapsing. In return, amphibians become prey for many other groups. Small reptiles hunt them along the waterline. Early bird forms and small feathered theropods exploit them as accessible protein. Nocturnal mammals search for them when dew settles. Amphibians become, therefore, an energy crossroads, moving energy from insects and aquatic life up into higher tiers of the food chain. They are not at the top, but without them, the flow of energy becomes fractured. Their role goes even deeper than that. Their thin, sensitive skin reacts quickly to environmental change, humidity, water, quality, temperature. In ecological terms, they are living indicators. The stable presence of amphibians in the Jurassic implies freshwater systems that were less chemically extreme, less violently variable, and capable of maintaining balance over long periods. This is reflected indirectly in the fossil record. The steady distribution of amphibian traces in freshwater sediments suggests environments that were not short-lived pockets of life, but durable landscapes. Amphibians also contribute to nutrient cycles in a quiet way. They feed in water and excrete on land, or the reverse. Each movement transports nutrients between two environments, linking aquatic ecosystems with terrestrial ones. In Jurassic forests, where water threads everywhere, that exchange occurs, continuously, slow, steady, persistent, exactly the tempo the system needs to avoid clogging at any point. They are not rulers. They are not easily noticed in the grand dramatic picture of giant dinosaurs. But amphibians act like ecological shock absorbers, taking in fluctuations between levels, softening disturbances before they spread. When insects surge, amphibians respond. When predators increase, amphibians decline, slowing the pace of change. That flexibility helps the whole system run smoothly. If the Jurassic world is a massive living machine, amphibians are not the big gears or the central engine. They are the lubricant, unnoticed, unglamorous, but without them, every movement grows harsher and easier to break. And because these boundary dwellers persist quietly, the world can maintain a steady breathing rhythm across tens of millions of years, long enough for bigger stories of dinosaurs, birds, and mammals to keep being written. The presence of amphibians also reflects environmental health. They need clean water, stable humidity, and suitable vegetation. When amphibians thrive, it suggests rivers, marshes, and moist soil layers functioning effectively. When they decline, it is an early sign of imbalance, a warning before larger disruptions arrive. Less noticed, but no less important, are small mammals, the modest descendants of the synapsid line, living quietly under the shadow of dinosaurs. In the Jurassic, mammals do not dominate. They are not large. They are not loud, but they are persistent. Most Jurassic mammals are about the size of a mouse or small weasel. Their bodies are compact, covered in fine fur that helps retain heat during cooler nights. Their jaws and teeth have already begun to specialize in incisors, canines, molars, allowing them to process food more efficiently than reptiles of similar size. They eat insects, small animals, and sometimes soft plant matter, exploiting energy sources that large animals ignore. More important than diet is lifestyle. Many small mammals are nocturnal. When large dinosaurs become less active when predation pressure shifts, the night becomes an ecological gap. In darkness, small mammals dig forage and raise young. Burrows help them avoid predators, buffer temperature swings, and create stable space for the next generation. They do not compete directly with dinosaurs. They avoid, hide, and endure. That strategy: stay small, live quickly, reproduce, steadily allows mammals to persist for tens of millions of years in a secondary role. Yet that role is not minor in ecosystem function. Small mammals are effective insect consumers, prey for many predators, and an essential part of energy flow. When you view the whole system from far enough away, something becomes clear, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow settling of understanding. These tiny creatures were never merely filling gaps. They are not leftovers after the big animals take the stage. They are the underlying tempo, the steady, continuous, nearly invisible rhythm on which every larger movement can occur without shattering the whole structure. They keep food chains from snapping by ensuring energy always has a path. Energy from sunlight enters leaves, from leaves to insects, from insects to amphibians, small mammals, and early birds. From there, it continues upward. There are no sudden leaps, no dead zones. Everything moves slowly, evenly, continuously, at the speed the biosphere can sustain over long time spans. Because of them, energy does not stay trapped too long at any tier. Plants do not accumulate biomass until they choke themselves. Insects do not explode until they strip ecosystems bare. Carcasses do not linger long enough to become disease reservoirs or biological bottlenecks. Everything is consumed, decomposed, redistributed, not fast enough to become chaos, not slow enough to become stagnation. Without this layer of small life, the world of the giant sauropods, weighing tens of tons, apex theropods hunting at the top, would gradually become rigid. Energy would flow through narrow channels that clog easily. Then a single disturbance, a long drought, a mistimed rainy season, A small shift in vegetation would trigger an overly violent response, and the system would break because there would be no buffer to absorb shock. The tiny creatures are that buffer. They do not prevent change. They soften it. They disperse impacts across time, across space, across many small links, instead of concentrating everything at one point. That is why after each disturbance, the system does not need to rebuild from nothing. It only needs to adjust and continue. So the Jurassic world does not run on the strongest stomps that shake the earth. It runs on small movements that never stop. Insect wings vibrating in humid air. Amphibian bodies quietly moving between water and land. Small mammals digging, foraging, then vanishing into darkness. Together, they form a deep, stable rhythm of life, one that lasts. And it is that rhythm, unflashy, hard to see, that allows the giants to exist, not the other way around. Imagine an ordinary day in a Jurassic forest, no disaster, no major hunt. Above, sauropods feed. In the middle layer, ornithopods move. Near the ground, stegosaurs graze the green carpet. But beneath all of that, insects still chew, leaves, amphibians still lie in wait, small mammals still dig. Each tiny action repeated millions of times creates the stability no giant species could maintain on its own. The world does not run on the hardest kicks. It runs on small movements, continuous and unceasing. And that is why, looking back at the Jurassic, what is astonishing is not only the size of life, but the unconscious cooperation between the large and the small. The tiny creatures never appear in grand paintings. They do not leave skeletons displayed in the great halls of museums. But without them, there would be no world for the giants to walk through. In the next chapter and the conclusion, we will step back to see the whole picture, a planet running smoothly during a rare long span before everything shifts again. Not in a single instant, but through slow, deep, irreversible movements, exactly the way life has always moved. If you stand still long enough in a Jurassic forest, the first thing you notice is not the sight, but the sound. There is no moment of absolute stillness, no complete silence. Even when no large creature is visible, the world is still speaking through layers of sound stacked upon one another, through vibrations traveling through air, through ground, through water, forming a continuous acoustic bed that life depends on to orient itself, to warn, to connect, and to endure. Jurassic sound is not the dramatic roaring you hear in movies. It is a sound field broad, deep, and steadily flowing, where each creature occupies its own band of frequencies, so that they do not drown one another out entirely. At the lowest level are the background tones that almost never vanish. Wind sliding through conifer forests, fern fronds brushing together in humid air water, moving slowly through hidden channels and flooded plains. These sounds do not require animals to produce them. They are the breath of the landscape, always present, always reminding you that the environment is in motion. On top of that base lies the world of insects, a high continuous band, so dense it has no clear beginning and no clear end. These are not individual noises you can easily name, but a blanket of vibration spread across space. Wings beating in flight, bodies brushing leaves, feet scraping damp surfaces, tiny movements occurring at an amplitude too small for any single individual to carry meaning on its own. If there were only one insect, you might notice nothing more than a passing flicker of sound. But when millions are active at once, feeding, flying, mating, fleeing, those small vibrations stack, merge, and stabilize into a background layer that never entirely disappears. This layer covers the rainforest drifts across the marshes, follows the riverbanks, and spills into open coastal gaps. It is not uniform. Where vegetation is dense, sound is held becoming thicker and softer. Where the landscape opens, wind pulls it outward, thinning the cover but extending its reach. Wherever you are, it remains like a stretched fabric of sound, suspended between habitats, changing shape without tearing. And what matters is that this layer is not random. The insect hum shifts with the hour of day thicker as temperatures rise thinner as the air cools. It responds to humidity heavier and more even after rain sharper and more broken in the rare dry intervals. It drifts with the seasons, not by falling into silence or erupting suddenly, but by a subtle tilt in the spectrum, as if the entire forest is adjusting its tone. Other creatures listen to those changes not through conscious attention, but through reflexes honed by evolution. When the acoustic bed is dense and steady, it signals safe conditions, enough moisture, enough food, little disturbance. When that layer thins unnaturally or breaks in a localized patch, it can signal danger, a predator, newly arrived weather about to shift, or a disruption in nearby water. In that world, a pocket of silence is more conspicuous than any loud noise. Insects then do not merely create sound. They regulate the biological tempo of the landscape. Amphibians rely on the acoustic bed to time their mating calls. Small mammals use it to decide when it is safe to leave the burrow. Early birds and small reptiles learn to distinguish between the normal layer and the tiny distortions that signal unusual movement. Even larger animals, though they may not hear the highest frequencies, clearly still register the overall change in the sound field through vibration, through air pressure, through the ground. In that way, insect sound becomes an environmental clock, marking time not with hands or numbers, but with intensity and texture. It does not command. It does not warn directly, but it creates the context in which every survival decision is made. Eat or don't eat, move or stay still, call or remain quiet. All of it happens in relationship to this baseline layer. And because that layer never fully stops, the Jurassic world never truly settles into stasis. Even when no colossal footsteps shake the soil, even when no deep calls travel through the forest, millions of small wings are still vibrating, keeping space in rhythm. Not a frantic rhythm, not chaos. A steady rhythm slow enough to stabilize, continuous enough not to be forgotten. In a world like this, insect sound is not background you can ignore. It is the lowest, widest flow of information, something every other creature, large or small, unconsciously uses to confirm that the world is still operating in its familiar way. And when that layer changes, the entire ecosystem listens, adjusts, and continues slowly, but without stopping. When the sun climbs high, the insect layer thickens. When rain arrives, it softens, yielding space to the sound of water, tapping leaves, dropping into soft mud, joining the moving channels. When night falls, some insects go quiet and yield their frequency band to other groups, nocturnal ones. So the acoustic landscape is never empty, only recolored. At the lower levels of the food chain, amphibians add to that harmony with calls that are low and steady. Near the water's edge, these sounds do not need to be loud. They need to be consistent. They mark territory, attract mates, and more than anything else, they announce that conditions are still safe. When familiar calls suddenly vanish, it is a danger signal. An entire area can go silent for a few moments, as if the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what is approaching. On land, small animals, reptiles, early mammals contribute sounds that are scattered, but information-rich, rustling in leaf-litter claws, tapping bark, a small body, slipping quickly through wet ground cover. These sounds are brief, low, and often do not repeat. Precisely because of that, they stand out against the continuous base layer, becoming warning signals to those that know how to listen. In that world, sudden silence is more dangerous than steady noise. Then come the large animals, those whose sound does not stop at the air, but travels deeper, slower, heavier, through the ground like ripples spreading across a quiet pond. When a herd of sauropods moves, the world does not hear them first. It feels them. Their footsteps do not register as a crisp thudding rhythm, do not bounce sharply between trunks, but merge into a low, even sustained chain of vibration, a deep pulse the soil receives before the ear can identify it. Those vibrations travel far beyond sight, beyond the straight lines of the forest. They pass through wet ground, through the soft sediments of flooded plains, through interlaced roots beneath the surface. A still creature can sense them through the feet, through the entire body pressed to the earth, a forewarning that an immense living mass is approaching even before it appears. This is not a warning in the sense of panic. It is information about direction, speed, distance. Within the herd, these vibrations become a kind of wordless communication. They signal that the group is still moving together, that the cadence has not broken, that no individual has fallen too far behind. In environments where vision is limited by dense trees, humid haze, and uneven ground, the ability to hear through the earth can matter as much as perhaps more than seeing with the eyes. Alongside footstep vibration, sauropods likely used deep, low-frequency calls, sounds that do not need to be loud to travel far. In that band, the forest does not absorb everything. Trunks do not stop it. Canopies do not fracture it. Instead, air and ground transmit it together, allowing the signal to travel without being shredded. These low calls are not sharp or piercing. They are thick, slow, and stable, suited to a large body that needs durable contact rather than instant reaction. Such signals are especially effective for keeping contact in large herds. They do not need to be constant. They do not need rapid repetition. They only need to appear at the right moments when the herd begins to move, when direction must be adjusted, when spacing risks stretching too far. A brief low call or a small sequence of tremors can be enough to remind the herd that it is still intact, that coordination is still holding. What is striking is that these signals are not only for the herd itself. Other animals in the ecosystem hear them too, not to communicate, but to map risk and opportunity. Smaller herbivores sense the tremors and know paths will soon open ahead. Predators register the presence of immense prey not to attack head-on, but to track weaker individuals, younger ones, or the chances that appear after a herd passes. In this way, sauropod sound and vibration are not merely the voice of one group. They become landscape signals, part of the environment itself, like wind or flowing water. When the tremor pattern is steady, the world knows order is still being kept. When that pattern breaks suddenly, irregularly, that may signal disturbance, an injury, an attack, an abnormal shift in the surroundings. In a world where size brings both advantage and risk, low-frequency vibrational communication is a fitting solution. It does not show off. It does not demand immediate attention. But it travels far, lasts, and is difficult to ignore. And it is through those slow pulses that the largest bodies ever to walk the earth could move together, stay connected, and persist in a humid forest world where eyesight is not always the most reliable tool. Other herbivores add to the soundscape in their own ways. Stegosaurs, low and heavy-bodied, may produce short warning sounds when threatened, or the friction and impact noises of moving through low vegetation. Ornithopods, more mobile, could produce higher, shorter signals well suited for rapid alarm upon spotting a predator. These sounds do not need to last. They need to trigger an immediate response run cluster scatter, depending on the moment. Predators speak too, but not often. For them, sound is a double-edged blade. A call that carries too clearly can reveal position. So most of the time, allosaurs and other theropods stay quiet while moving, leaving traces, as small vibrations snapping leaves, or heavy breath when they are very near. When they do vocalize, it is often with low, brief sounds, threats, warnings, disputes. These are not meant for wide communication. They are meant to impose distance. Notably, the Jurassic acoustic space is layered by habitat. In dense forest canopy and wood absorb higher frequencies, allowing lower frequencies to travel farther. In flooded plains, water reflects sound-stretching calls and transmitting vibrations more effectively. In open ground, wind carries sound far, but also distorts signals. Each environment forces creatures to adjust how they produce sound and how they listen, an acoustic evolution, running alongside physical form. The Jurassic sky is not still either. Above-flying animals, especially pterosaurs, produce a different kind of sound. When cutting across membrane wings, heavy takeoffs, sharp calls to keep contact or defend space. These sounds are often brief and location-based because in open air, sound disperses easily. The arrival of early bird forms adds smaller, sharper calls, still not as complex as modern birdsong, but enough to mark the presence of a new group experimenting with the sky. Sound also changes with the day-night rhythm. In daylight, the acoustic bed is dense, continuous layered. At night, when many large animals rest, the higher layers of insects and amphibians become more prominent, while unusual noises, a branch breaking a footstep, gain far more weight. Night is not quieter. It is more stripped down, so each sound carries more consequence. The most important thing to understand is this sound in the Jurassic is not a byproduct of life. It is a survival tool. It helps allocate space, who is where, who is approaching. It regulates behavior, when to feed, when to rest, when to move. It creates deliberate silences, moments when the entire system listens to avoid danger. And it allows large animals to exist without meeting too often, reducing conflict and energy waste. If you close your eyes and let imagination stand still long enough, you stop hearing each species separately. You do not cleanly separate insects from amphibians from the deep tremor of massive feet. Instead, you hear a sound field, continuous, deep, and moving very slowly, like a tide rising and falling so steady you do not need to see it to know it is coming and going. This sound field has no obvious climax and no ending, only subtle variations enough for those living inside it to sense and respond. Within that sound field, life reads life without ever meeting face to face. A small shift in the baseline layer, a strange pocket of quiet, a tremor out of phase is enough for the whole system to adjust. Herbivores pause and draw closer. Predators slow and listen. Small creatures retreat into safety. No command is needed. No explicit signal. Only a difference just large enough to trigger the evolutionary memory written deep into bodies. Sound here is not made to perform or to attract attention. It is an environment. Like water for fish, the sound field surrounds every creature and seeps into the smallest decisions: when to eat, when to rest, when to move, when to go silent. Species that cannot read that sound field are eliminated not by a single dramatic confrontation, but by thousands of small wrong choices repeated over time. That is why the Jurassic world is never silent. Not because it is loud or chaotic, but because absolute silence is not a stable condition. When sound disappears completely, it is not peace. It is a sign of rupture, of a food chain snapped, of an environment no longer able to sustain the basic rhythm of life. Silence in that context is not rest. It is the final warning. Creatures in the Jurassic do not fear steady noise. They fear its absence. A living forest always has sound, however small, however low, however nearly imperceptible. And as long as those sounds persist, the world is still functioning, still adjusting, still capable of recovering after disturbance. If you keep your eyes closed and listen longer still, that sound field stops feeling foreign. It becomes breath. And within that breath, you understand that life does not need to shout to prove it exists. It only needs to keep producing small, steady signals long enough so the world never falls into complete silence. Jurassic sound, then, is evidence of balance at work. When all layers are present, from insects to amphibians, from immense footfalls to wind, you know the ecosystem is alive. And when one layer vanishes, it is not merely the loss of a noise, it is the loss of a function. In that world, hearing is living, and listening is the only way to endure for the long term. If you pull your gaze back even farther out beyond the forest, beyond the flooded plains, beyond the herds, moving slowly across the land, you begin to notice a foundational truth of the Jurassic: that world was never still. Beneath every seemingly stable landscape, beneath every steady rhythm of life, the earth was still moving, stretching, cracking, and restructuring itself. Not through constant jolts, but through processes that were long, slow, and irreversible. The Jurassic unfolded against the backdrop of a planet continuing to drift away from the once solid unity of an ancient supercontinent. Earth's crust was being pulled taut by deep forces below opening vast rift zones that ran for thousands of kilometers. In those places, mantle magma rose closer to the surface, heating, thinning, and weakening the crust. Volcanoes were not rare interruptions. They were the natural consequence of a planet rearranging itself. Many Jurassic volcanoes did not erupt in a violent, short-lived burst and then fall silent. They existed more like wounds in the crust that healed slowly. They worked in long cycles lasting thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years, erupting, quieting, then erupting again, not like an outburst of anger, but like a steady leak of energy stored deep below. The basaltic lava they released was not explosively dramatic. It was dense, heavy, and slow, obeying the shape of the terrain more than imposing itself upon it. These lava flows did not race like waterfalls of fire in modern imagination. They crept forward meter by meter, spreading along the gentlest slopes, rolling over roots, trunks, and undergrowths, without needing to annihilate everything in an instant. The forest did not ignite all at once. It was buried gradually, layer upon layer, as steam escaped from heated wood, as hot air rose, as life retreated slowly before a threat that could not be stopped. When lava entered valleys, it filled the lowest ground, first places that had once been rivers, marshes, or floodplains. The flow of water was blocked and forced to seek new routes. Streams changed course, not because of a sudden decision, but because the old pathway no longer existed. Over time, an entire region's hydrological network was rebuilt. New channels formed, new lakes appeared, new wetlands spread, changes that could persist for millions of years after the lava itself had cooled. When the basalt flows slowed and began to cool, their surfaces hardened, first forming a rigid crust, while the interior beneath remained hot and moved sluggishly. Cooling was uneven, producing cracks, column-like structures, and rough, broken surfaces. At first glance, the landscape looked bare and dark, showing no sign of life, a biological hush that seemed as though it might last forever. But that barrenness was only temporary. The moment temperatures dropped, enough weathering began. Rain fell onto rock that had been hot and then cooled, prying open new fractures. Wind carried dust and spores into tiny crevices. Volcanic ash collected in hollows, mixing with broken stone to form the first foundation of new soil. There was no sudden return of green, only very small signs of renewal, appearing long before any large creature could notice. On a planetary scale, these long phases of eruption did more than reshape local terrain. They also helped regulate the atmosphere. CO2 and water vapor released from lava added to the air, reinforcing the Jurassic's warm climate. At the same time, fine dust and sulfur-bearing gases could soften sunlight in the short term, creating brief cooler intervals, small oscillations layered on top of an otherwise stable climatic baseline. In that way, Jurassic volcanoes were not separate from life. They were part of a long cycle, breaking old landscapes, laying the groundwork for new ones, interrupting biological flow, and then opening different evolutionary pathways. The cooled basalt layers did not mark the end of a world. They were the quiet beginning of ecosystems that would form afterward slowly in layers at the pace the planet allowed. But that is only the first step of the story. Alongside lava came ash-fine mineral particles thrown into the air, then drifting down slowly to veil the landscape in a thin sheet. Ash could clog leaves, reduce photosynthesis in the short term, and place pressure on ecosystems. Yet over the long term, volcanic ash is one of the most effective soil enrichers on Earth. It carries trace elements, phosphorus, potassium, iron ingredients plants need to grow vigorously. In the months and years after an eruption, the landscape could look desolate, and then pioneer life arrived. Ferns and other spore-bearing plants were among the first to take hold on the new ground. They did not need deep soil. They needed only moisture and light. Their shallow roots held the substrate in place, reduced erosion, and created conditions for other species to follow. There was no rushing, only succession. As a thin plant cover began to form, insects returned first, the detritus feeders, then the leaf eaters. After them came amphibians, small reptiles, and early mammals. Each group arrived when the environment could support it. This chain of renewal required no conductor. It unfolded because biological thresholds were crossed in natural order. On a larger scale, volcanic activity also influenced climate. The release of greenhouse gases, especially CO2, helped sustain the Jurassic's warmth. Meanwhile, aerosols and sulfur dioxide from major eruptions could temporarily cool the surface by reflecting sunlight. The result was short-term climate variability layered over a long-term stable trend, not enough to erase entire ecosystems, but enough to test their capacity to adapt. It was precisely this kind of just enough instability that shaped Jurassic life. It did not allow narrow specialization to persist untested for too long. It forced species to maintain a margin of flexibility in diet habitat and reproductive timing. Those able to spread quickly, regenerate quickly, or travel far gained clear advantages after each disruption. On flooded plains, ash and volcanic sediments were redistributed by rivers and streams, forming nutrient-rich bands of soil. Watercourses shifted new marshes, formed old wetlands were filled. These changes opened new habitats, while closing old ones, a continual smena of landscapes. Sauropods able to travel long distances and consume vast amounts of vegetation were often among the first to take advantage of these renewed zones, clearing paths that other groups could follow. Volcanoes also affected coastal oceans. Lava entering the sea created new rocky foundations, altering depth and currents. Dissolved minerals stimulated plankton growth, boosting local productivity. This cascade of effects moved from microbes to marine predators, then back toward shore, where pterosaurs, early birds, and shoreline animals searched for food. What must be emphasized is this renewal is not a simple return to the way things were. Every cycle of disruption and recovery leaves its imprint. Species composition can shift. Forest structure can change. Migration routes can move. The Jurassic did not repeat itself. It moved forward through small adjustments, accumulating across millions of years. Seen from this angle, volcanoes no longer appear as destroyers standing opposite life, but as a slow heartbeat of the planet, never constant, never loud, but never disappearing. They break, but not to erase. They interrupt, but not to end. Each time fire rises to the surface and ash settles from the sky, the world is not reset to zero. It is recalibrated in ways life has learned to endure. Without volcanoes, soils would slowly grow poorer. Minerals drawn up by plants would not be replaced. Nutrient cycles would close too tightly, and ecosystems would gradually lose their ability to renew themselves. Without fine ash falling from the sky, without lava weathering into fresh ground, landscapes would drift towards sameness, green but fragile. Alive but lacking resilience when confronted by disturbances from elsewhere. It is the alternation between breaking and rebuilding, between ash covering everything and young leaves pushing through, that creates space for diversity. Each disturbance opens temporary ecological gaps. Pioneer species arrive first. Deep specialists arrive later. Species that cannot keep pace are removed not by catastrophe itself, but by the tempo of time. In that way, the planet avoids the accumulation of risk, avoids packing too much biomass, too many ecological relationships into a single brittle structure. If you return to the opening scene, standing still inside a world that seems stable, where forests stretch outward, rivers run steadily, and herds move in familiar cadence, you gradually realize that this stability is not a natural default and not a random gift. It is the outcome of millions of years of continuous adjustment of countless cycles in which fire and stone arrived and withdrew, leaving behind new soils and new opportunities for life. Beneath every forest carpet lies ash that has cooled. Beneath every ecological corridor lies rock that once flowed molten. Living creatures may not remember these things, but they remain in the structure of the landscape, in soil chemistry, in fertility, in how water soaks in and moves. The history of fire does not vanish. It becomes the foundation of present stability. And on that foundation, life does not try to defeat disturbance. It does not attempt to eliminate instability. Instead, it learns to live with it, learns not to place everything into a single form, a single strategy. The longest-lasting species are not the strongest in a moment. They are the ones flexible enough to adjust when the ground beneath them changes. The Jurassic, then, is not the story of a motionless paradise. It is the story of a dynamic balance where stability is maintained not by avoiding disruption, but by absorbing and dispersing it over time. This is how Earth sustained immense bodies, complex networks, and ecosystems resilient enough to persist for tens of millions of years. And if you listen very slowly, very deeply, you can sense that even in the calmest moments, the planet's living rhythm continues not to destroy, but to prepare for the next renewal. The Jurassic endured long enough, not because it was perfectly peaceful, but because its disruptions arrived at a pace life could keep up with. Volcanoes rose, ash fell, forests were erased, and forests returned not identical to before, but compatible enough for the system to keep running. That is one of Earth's deepest lessons. Endurance is not the same as stillness. And if you listen more closely, listening not only with the ear, but with the full weight of attention, you begin to notice that beneath the forest's acoustic layer, beneath the wing beats and flowing water, and even beneath the low tremor of enormous herds, there is another rhythm, deeper, slower, and encompassing everything. It is not a sound you can clearly hear, and not a vibration you can immediately feel. It is the rhythm of the planet. That rhythm does not speed up when life blooms, and it does not slow down when forests burn. It continues steady heavy like a background motion to which everything else must adapt. Continental plates stretch millimeter by millimeter each year. The mantle moves deep beneath the crust. Heat gathers, releases, and gathers again. There is no climax, no finale, only continuation. This rhythm has framed every story before it: forests that grow and vanish, herds that appear and disperse, evolutionary lineages that experiment, fail, and succeed. Life does not control the planet's rhythm. It follows it, sometimes in harmony, sometimes forced to adjust, but never able to step outside it. In the Jurassic, that planetary rhythm was slow enough for life to adapt. Volcanoes did not erupt without pause. Continents did not split in an instant. Climate did not swing violently from one generation to the next. Because of that, complex ecological networks had time to form, to experiment, to correct themselves. Large bodies could exist not only because there was enough food, but because the planet beneath them remained stable long enough. But that rhythm never stopped. When the Jurassic closed, it continued carrying Earth into new states, new structures, new worlds. Once dominant creatures disappeared. Small groups that had lived in shadow stepped into open light. Oceans widened. Mountain ranges lifted. Everything changed, but the baseline rhythm remained. If you widen your view even farther beyond eras, beyond extinctions, beyond the familiar milestones of life's history, you see that the planet's rhythm belongs to no single age. It does not belong to dinosaurs. It does not belong to birds. It does not belong to mammals or humans. It existed before there were storytellers, and it will continue long after every familiar story has ended. And that is why, when we look back at the Jurassic, a world of humid forests, warmth, sound, and movement, what remains is not only the image of huge animals or strange landscapes. What remains is a lesson in tempo, that life does not require a perfect planet. It requires a moving planet slow enough to adapt, to flexible enough to change, and strong enough not to collapse when everything else shifts. The planet's rhythm is still continuing even now. Slow, heavy, never stopping. And within that rhythm, life in every form keeps learning how to endure, to adapt, and then to make room for the next chapters not yet written, but framed long ago. And as we step out of that forest, as the sound of insects, dinosaur footsteps, and the trembling earth slowly fade away, perhaps you will realize one thing. The Earth of the dinosaur age was not a world of chaos. It was a world of the right conditions: warm enough temperatures, high enough humidity, dense enough vegetation, time long enough. And within those conditions, life expanded to its limits. Giant creatures were not miracles. They were the natural result of a planet operating in its own stable way. Predators were not monsters. They were the necessary pressure that kept the system from collapsing. Small beings, insects, small mammals. Early birds were not supporting characters. They were the quiet heartbeat that kept that world turning. And deeper than all of it was an earth that never stood still, always cracking, erupting, regenerating, and learning how to rebalance itself. When you look at a massive skeleton in a museum or hear the name the Jurassic, remember this. It is not only a story about dinosaurs. It is the story of how great life was once allowed to become because a planet made it possible. If you have walked this journey with me all the way to the end, leave a comment. It doesn't need to be long. Just tell me, what time are you listening to this video, and where in the world are you? If you enjoy history and science told slowly like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Other journeys through geological ages, through worlds before humans, and through stories the Earth has not yet finished telling are still waiting ahead. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a peaceful sleep or a night full of quiet reflection.